So I'm going to have a word of prayer, and we will sing. Let's pray. Lord, thanks for the opportunity to worship you, Lord, by learning more about you. Lord, more detail that we can value. Lord, thank you for this opportunity to come together. Lord, we're so grateful that Dr. Bookman chose to come down here and at our request and bless us with what you have poured into him. Lord, he's your servant, and he is faithful with the gift that you have given him to teach. And we're grateful for that, Lord. I pray that, Lord, you utilize the information, the truth that is given tonight. Lord, minister to us with your Spirit so that we are able to walk closer to you, to be better learners of you. We love you. We ask this in Jesus' name. Amen.
All right, as Sam said, we'll kick things off with singing one song. We'll sing Be Thou My Vision, and I invite you to stand with us. Just A or EA. Be thou my vision, O Lord of my heart, not be all else to me save that thou art. Thou my best thought by day or by night, waking or sleeping, thy wisdom and thou my true word. I ever with thee and thou with me, Lord. Thou my great Father, I thy true Son. Thou in me dwelling, and I with thee one. Riches I heed not, nor man's empty praise. Thou mine inheritance now and always. Thou and thou only first in my heart. High King of heaven, my treasure thou art. High King of heaven, my victory won. May I reach heaven's joys, O bright heaven's sun. Heart of my own heart, whatever befall, still be my vision, O ruler of all. Heart of my own heart, whatever befall, still be my vision, O ruler of all. Have a seat.
I trust it'll be a profitable time. Now, I like to use my computer, and it's up on that screen. Can you see that? Would that be helpful? The microphone as well? Okay, I'm taking over here, folks, pastoral staff. Sorry about this. Now, let me say, we struggled last night to make this work, and we think we have it figured out. If it doesn't work, I'm going to crawl into a fetal position and suck my thumb. But I think we can make it work, all right? But no, it's not all that important, but I do appreciate, having said that. All right, well, listen, I'm going to do one other thing here, forgive me. I'd like to have the scriptures we're going to use, and this is not it, we'll get there, but on the screen, but let me take you back to the notes. All right, listen. Sam asked me to focus in, well, he actually gave me a lot of liberty, and I decided to spend some time thinking, as I mentioned this morning, about the boyhood of Jesus Christ. And let me begin, and we talked about this last night, and I realized that there were a few really, really faithful folks who were here last night, and I may trip on some of the same material. Forgive me, I kind of wandered into the same material last night a little bit. But I want to start out by saying that Paul expressed his desire in Philippians 3 that I may know him. And he said that all of his Jewish credentials meant nothing, and he was anxious simply to know Jesus and the power of his resurrection. And that is a noble and a life-shaping aspiration, to know Jesus. Now, we only have the four Gospels as the source of, there are references to Jesus, and I can walk you through them in extra-biblical literature from the early centuries and so on, but none of them has anything to contribute, and none of them has any authority. What we have are four marvelous eyewitness records of the life Jesus lived. But you know that there's not a lot of focus on his boyhood. And yet I think that there is much to learn, and there is one very, very blessed passage, and that's the Luke 2 passage when Jesus, at the age of 12, goes with his parents to Jerusalem. And that's where we're going to wind up later this afternoon. Now, in that regard, Sam and the folks here at the church have been very, very generous to me, if slightly mean-spirited to you, to give me as much time as they have. So please you can be entirely informal, and you want to go up and get something to drink or something, that's fine. All right, but at any rate, what I'd like to do, and I just thought, I think I have the time. Number one, let me begin with an emphasis. Let me just challenge you, as I did last night, but because this is pretty much, as I said last night, I think it is the habit, not the habit so much, but the tendency of a lot of believers, and serious thinking believers, to just undervalue, underappreciate the real humanity of Jesus. And I don't mean that in terms of their doctrinal affirmations, because any institution, ministry, individual, whatever, who claims any measure of orthodoxy is going to insist that Jesus is God very God, man very man. He is the Word made flesh. And yes, that's what I wanted to say. And so we acknowledge that in terms of our doctrinal commitment. What I mean when I say that Christians tend to undervalue Jesus' real humanity is the way we read the actual stories. As we read, you're going to be so refreshed, and I think you're going to be many times more orthodox if you very, very deliberately embrace and celebrate the reality that Jesus' humanity was absolutely real and genuine. Jesus took upon himself unfallen humanity. Now, I said last night, I'm going to go just a minute with this, but I think sometimes I think perhaps we have gotten a little too accustomed to that reality. And I think there is help in just stopping for a minute and pondering the wonder of that reality. I said last night that I don't know that God has ever set before mankind a truth claim which more thoroughly drives us to the end of ourselves and thus to our knees than that simple truth claim. The Word became flesh. That is really staggering. You know what? To make that point, let me just ask you to do a little spiritual or a thought exercise with me. Imagine living in that day. Imagine you're living in Jesus' day, because it's one thing to contemplate it in the abstract. Let's think about living in that day, and let's say you're Jewish and you know it. You're very Jewish. And you are committed. You and your people have always been surrounded by various peoples and communities who have their own sets of gods, and their gods are nothing more than men blown big, and they live on, their gods supposedly live on a big hill outside of town, and they just war big and lust big and revenge big, but they're just men blown big, right? But your God, Yahweh, is not a man. The Old Testament, one of the primary, I don't know if we can rank them, but one of the very important and oft appealed to attributes of God as he reveals himself is his holiness. Now, you tell me, what does holy mean? What does the idea mean? H-O-L-Y. Somebody? Set apart. You hear this all the time. And it's exactly what it means. Interestingly, by the time we get to the New Testament, there's no tension or contradiction between these two, but in the New Testament, the idea of holiness is probably primarily a moral dynamic. That is, he is set apart from sin, from wickedness. Is that where your mind goes? On the other hand, it's perfectly legitimate. It's what we have. But God, in his revelation of himself in the Old Testament, when he speaks of himself as holy, he really means set apart from the created order. There is a term which has been much misused. When I say set apart from creation, did I lose it? Oh, see, I was just going to have fun with it. Why would it do that to me? I'm going to try and get this here. Oh, yeah. I know it, but I will try again. Show you what kind of guy I am. Oh, look there. All right, we'll see. I like having a whiteboard, and this gives me a whiteboard. But watch, in the Old Testament, God, really, his holiness equals transcendence. Now that's did I leave an E out? I may have, yeah. But that is or a C. But that is a right there, I'm sorry. How embarrassing. That is listen, there's a phrase that is much used, and I think when you speak of God's holiness in the Old Testament, the idea is he is the holy other. You see that? W-H-O-L-L-Y. The point is, all of those pretend gods, those gods false in him, all those are just men blown big. It's just part of God is the holy other. And in the Jewish mind, I'm taking you back. So you're Jewish, you're living in the first century, and you know that your God, the God who has revealed himself to you, has made covenant with your people, who has watched over your people, whose word you know well and cherish, that God is not a man. Contrary to those pagan gods, your God is not a man. Now imagine, with that fundamental commitment on your part, here stands a man standing before you, and he claims to be God. Just try and imagine and I said last night that I think it's so helpful to understand that what Jesus claimed concerning himself throughout his ministry, that he was Messiah and that he was God come in the flesh, and that's exactly what he claimed. It's explicit in the scriptures several times. The fact is that those are unspeakably difficult claims to believe. And you really, as you read the Gospels, you have to factor that in. And there came a day when Jesus got his disciples, this is late in his ministry, to a region called Caesarea Philippi, and said, whom do you say that I am? And Peter, on behalf of the apostles, said, thou art the Christ, Messiah, the Son of the living God. And Jesus exulted, blessed are you, Simon Peter. Flesh and blood has not taught this to you, but my Father in heaven. Now, I've heard people, do you remember this passage I'm talking about, Matthew 16? insinuated that thought into Peter's mind at that moment. Like, that's not what revelation is. Like Jesus said, "Whom do you say that I am?" And Peter said, "Thou art the Christ, the Son of the living God." Where'd that come from? I don't know where that came from. Well, no. When Jesus says, "My flesh," in the claim, and I think in that part of that process had to be Peter going back to the Scriptures to demonstrate for himself, do the Berean strategy. I love the Berean strategy. Remember, the Bereans were more noble than the Thessalonians because they searched the Scriptures to see if Paul's remarkable claims concerning this Nazarene were so. And if you do, you're going to discover this is exactly what was prophesied by God. But the point is, Jesus exults when Peter confesses that. And I like to say, I think Peter maybe had to choke that out of his throat. Honest to goodness, I think he may have thought, who do you say that I am? Master, thou art the, did I lose it? No. Excuse me?
When you get to Caesarea Philippi, you have to remember that all of those niches on the wall were once filled with the idols of the ancient world.
Yeah. No, the point is well said. Hey, you can visit it today. It's a national park in Israel. And a lot of people go there and say Jesus came here and talked about that he's going to die. Jesus never went there. He went to the regions of Caesarea Philippi. And that's another set of ideas. But he's exactly right. And so even there in that region, you have Jesus has taken his disciples to a place where it is just deliberately, disgustingly given over to paganism and pagan idols and so on. Specifically the god Pan, or Mr. Tumnus, if you remember him from Lion the Witch. But that is the god Pan, for what it's worth. But at any rate, I go back to it. I think Peter is probably saying, Lord, Jesus asked him, who do you say that I am? Thou art the Christ, and then maybe gulp. Whoever thought I, a thinking Jewish man, would be confessing something like this? Thou art the Christ, the Son of the living God. So that's what Jesus claimed concerning himself, obviously. And here's what I'm, for just a moment, just ponder that the Word became flesh. And you don't know me very well. I've been doing some thinking. I don't even like to say it out loud. I think maybe I'm God come in the flesh. Well, how would you react? You wouldn't let me play with sharp things, right? There are places you put people. By the way, well into his Galilean ministry, Jesus returned to his home in Capernaum, and his brothers, this is, and you say, well, wait a minute, Bookman. If you claim to be God come in the flesh, that's silly. But when Jesus made the claim, it was much more easy to believe because I've seen pictures, and he had a halo, and you don't have a halo. See? No, he didn't have a halo. He didn't glow in the dark. He was a man. And you know what? Before he was a man, he was a boy. Before he was a boy, he was a baby. Before that, he was an embryo. Jesus lived all there is to live of a human life. And so I go back to it. Ponder, it's good to really ponder for a minute the wonder of God becoming flesh. But here's my concern, that because there is bottomless mystery, and it is bottomless, you'll never fully understand. I don't think in the life to come we'll fully understand what it means, the dynamics perhaps, but how it can be the ontology of God becoming man. But that's what the Bible says. And when you encounter that sort of a knee-buckling claim in the Scriptures, there is a tendency to, I like to say, fall in one ditch or the other, to question one or grow careless about one in order to protect the other. And I think that a lot of cases in our circles, because we are so zealous for the reality, oh my goodness, look where you live, for the reality of Jesus' deity, because we're so committed to that, and maybe we're a little fearful of or careless about the reality of his genuine humanity. So I'm just going to say, and where that, and this is, whenever you get into this discussion, there were a couple of specific elements of human life that come up. Was this true of Jesus and so on? And one of them is, and I asked this question last night, but I'm going to ask it of you just to make the point, has to do with the possibility that he could be ignorant. Is it possible that during his life on earth, Jesus could be ignorant of something? And quite frankly, the Bible could not be more clear. It's clear that he had to learn. And I bring it up because we're going to talk about it. I mentioned last night, it's kind of an odious thing, and I want you to, here, I'll hypnotize you. When I snap my fingers, forget what I'm going to tell you right now. But there is a late and not apocryphal, but a Gnostic and heretical so-called gospel of the infancy. We only have it in a fragment, and it comes out of Egypt. But at any rate, that says that when Jesus was born, as his mother was wrapping him in swaddling clothes, he looked up at her and said, "Handle me carefully, I'm the Son of God." Well, that, like I say, that takes some of the fun out of Christmas, if you know what I mean. But the fact of the matter is, see, what's at stake here is why is that ludicrous? And by the way, can I say that the religious heresy which produced those books was called Gnosticism, and it despised Jesus' humanity. Because remember, the Gnostics believed that matter is wrong, is wicked, and spirit is good, and so they despised Jesus' humanity. They despised the doctrine, and they tried to obviate it from their theology. But the fact is, I go back to it, that why is that odious? I mean, why is that ludicrous? Because it is not incidental to humanity to be born presentient. That's what a baby is born. It has to learn, it has to grow, it has to discover itself. All of that, Jesus lived. That's what I'm trying to say to you. So I'll leave it alone with this. What I would encourage you about is this, that as you read all of the stories of the Gospels, I would suggest that our tendency, that I really want you to check, who am I, for heaven's sakes, but I encourage you, I think it'll be good for you. Our tendency is to assume as we read those stories that Jesus is living out this or that event at a level or on a plane entirely different from our own. That he's just kind of a hydroplaning through life and never has to quite put his foot down, because after all, he's God, and so, and even with regard to his knowledge. So I'll finish the thought. Well, let me back up. It's clear that Jesus had to grow and that he had to learn, and that in his ministry, we talked about last night or yesterday afternoon, was it possible for Jesus to set out to do something and fail? You bet. I used the verse last night out of Mark 7, verse 24. He went into a house, he would have no man know it, but he could not be hid. And now the woman comes and asks for her daughter, and he has to try something. So Jesus knows what it is to have a noble, necessary aspiration. He's got to get something done. He sets out to do it. He's frustrated. He finds a different way to do it. That's why he wound up at Caesarea Philippi, the regions of. All right, so I lose my way. Here's what I'm encouraging you. As you read the various pericopes, as they're called, the various events of Jesus' life, the tendency is to sort of assume that he's living it out at a level other than ours. Unless there's something in the passage that kind of forces you, reminds you of his, he got hungry or he got sleepy and reminds you of you. I would encourage you to do the exact opposite. I would encourage you, wherever you are in the scripture, in the Gospels, whatever story you're reading, assume that Jesus is living that out within the limitations of unfallen humanity. Unless there is something in the context, in the story, to demonstrate that the Spirit of God empowered him to use his divine attributes. That makes sense to you? Now, and he can do that, obviously. I said yesterday, forgive me, I was an echo in the room, but Jesus knew that a woman at the well had 5 husbands, having never met her before. Clearly that was supernatural knowledge, and she recognized it. He met a man under a fig tree by the name of Nathanael and knew his name and identified him, and he recognized. Nathanael's response was, "Surely you are the Son of God." All right, did Jesus have that capacity? Yes, he did. But did he live in constant exercise of For instance, his omniscience. Well, like I say, when he went to raise Lazarus from the tomb, after he assured Martha that he was the resurrection and the life, the next thing he said was, where is the tomb? If I could find the tomb, I'd raise this fellow from the dead, if you don't mind. So I think, honestly, he is looking for the tomb. The fig tree, I use this illustration all the time, but Jesus on Monday morning comes into Jerusalem and he sees a tree that has summer blossoms. It's a fig tree, and the fig tree in that part of the world produces actually about 4 harvests of figs a year, but there is a winter fig which is gnarly and not harvestable, and you are welcome to snack on that. But that always comes in the winter before the summer blossoms. So if you see the summer blossoms, there ought to be winter figs, and Jesus goes to get some of those and finds that it has no figs and curses the fig tree. You remember this story? Well, the point is, I always say you only got 2 choices. Either one, that Jesus was kind of pretending that he was thinking, well, I'm God and come in the flesh, and I'm in constant exercise of my omniscience, so I know very well that there are no figs on that tree, but I have a point to make, so I'm going to go over there and pretend to be looking for figs and pretend to be upset when well, you don't believe Jesus lived that way, and it's odious, and furthermore, most importantly, if he lived that way, he's not a high priest who can be touched with the feeling of our infirmities, because we'd be genuinely schnookered by the fig tree. So was he, all right? And to me, that's the only other choice you've got. One illustration. The man let down through the roof. Now, we all love this story. But this is the way the story goes. There's so much theology packed into this story, and I can get lost awful easily. But you know the story because Jesus is in Capernaum, and there's such a crowd. See, here's an interesting reality. Jesus had moved his family from Nazareth to Capernaum. He moved his family. I said it last night, but I'll emphasize it here because I think it's meaningful. When Jesus' adopted father, Joseph, died, and we can be confident that he died sometime before Jesus went to be baptized by John. Because once you get into the ministry of Jesus, there are several times where he encounters his family, and Joseph is never there when he should have been there. If he was still alive, he would have been. And then on the cross, when Joseph died, Jesus would have, must have, and in the record very clearly did, become the head of that family. And I like to say, I think it's important to understand, Jesus knows what it is to raise a family. And that family is going to break his heart. Those whom you love the dearest, those you pour into most carefully, have the capacity to break your heart most awfully. And Jesus' own brothers don't believe him, John 7 and verse 2 and so on. Now, they're ultimately going to come to faith. That's another set of ideas. But the point is that Jesus did, in fact, move his family. When he left Nazareth, he was lived in Nazareth for 30 years. I'm going to come back to that village in just a moment. But when he left Nazareth, when he commenced Nazareth sits on the top of a ridge. And it's a very steep ridge on the north side. It's on the south side. It's a more sloping. But there's no easy way to get to Nazareth. And once you get there, there's nothing to do but turn around and leave. It's not on its way to anywhere. So it is a very, very inauspicious place from which to conduct an intense, deliberate, itinerant ministry that Jesus is going to carry on for 18 months in Galilee. You see, Jesus came to offer himself to Israel, and it couldn't be done by proxy. It had to be done face to face. And an amazing, intense itinerant ministry. Jesus gives himself miraculous vindication. Late in those 18 months, remember this, Matthew 10, he's going to send 12 apostles out 2 by 2. But if you read carefully, especially in Luke 10, a parallel passage, you discover that those weren't preaching teams going out independently. Those were front men. And that was Jesus sending the apostles out 2 by 2 to go to this village or this little cluster of homes and say, all right, the Nazarene is going to be in that town over there next Tuesday, and get them together, because Jesus is so intent on saturating the land. God is in the business of closing every mouth. And so that generation which was confronted by Jesus' claims concerning himself and his offer of the Old Testament kingdom are going to turn it down. But before that happens, Jesus is going to make sure that he confronts that nation face to face. Later on, he's going to do the same thing down in the other pocket Jewish population, which is Judea, and he's going to send 70 out. Remember that in Luke 10 when he sends 70 out. In each case, Jesus is being wise as a serpent. He's being, all right, now I lose my way. The point is, Nazareth was entirely ill-suited as the headquarters of an itinerant ministry, but Capernaum was perfectly well-suited. And for other reasons, Jesus, before, it's in John chapter 2, after the miracle at Cana, it says that he took his family to Capernaum, and then Matthew 4 and verse 13 says explicitly that he moved to Capernaum. And once he begins his public ministry, when he returns to Capernaum, it's called his city. He returned to his city. Now, he was born in Bethlehem. His family moved to Nazareth, and he lived there for 30 years. And then just before he began his public ministry, he relocated his family, which, by the way, is big stuff. You live your life out in the village where you were born and your ancestors. So to move his family, it was big stuff. But where am I taking you? The curious thing is that not very far into Jesus' Galilean ministry, and the Galilean ministry is when he really gets serious about making his claims publicly, all right? And so not very far into the Galilean ministry, the word gets out, and pretty soon people are bringing their sick folk from Jordan, from Lebanon, from Syria, from Egypt, and so on. People are coming. You would, wouldn't you? And they were bringing. Now, here's the thing. Jesus, he would go out on these preaching tours. He'd be gone for several weeks and months. And he didn't leave a travel itinerary. So if you're coming from far away, where are you going to go? You're going to go to Capernaum. So now when Jesus would come back to Capernaum, many times there were such crowds that according to the Bible, he couldn't go into town to eat. That's when his brothers come and try and take him home, thinking he would be mad. So the point is, I have way too much background, forgive me, but it was so crowded that these people who had brought somebody probably from afar let a man down through the roof. Now here's the thing I want to ask you. You remember the story. The Pharisees by this time, Jesus' enemies by this time, are dogging his steps, and they're trying to catch him in some sort of, catch him in some way that they can accuse him before the people. Well, at any rate, so I want you to picture, here are the Pharisees up in the front seat. Jesus is preaching. A man is let down through the roof, and Jesus, all I want out of this, way too much time, but let down through the roof, and Jesus turns to him. Remember what he said? Son, thy sins be forgiven thee. Your faith has made you whole, spiritually whole. Well, here's my point. I can still remember what I was talking about. You can't. So let me tell you what I was talking about. Talking about Jesus. When you read the passage, assume that he's working within the limits of unfallen humanity, unless there's something. Because here's the point. The Bible says, Mark 3, that when Jesus said, the Pharisees on the front row began to murmur among themselves. And then it says that Jesus, knowing their thoughts, all right, now you're welcome to this. Believe me, you can read it either way. But do you not read that to mean knowing their thoughts? Supernaturally reading their thoughts? So I'm saying to you, all right, let's think. Number one, absent omniscience. Jesus was the most blindingly intuitive man who ever lived, man or woman. Jesus didn't need anybody to teach him about man because he knew what was in man. And I don't believe the point is that by reason of his supernatural care. I think it means he was such a student of Scripture. He knew man. Now my point is this, and you got to understand, Jesus is baiting those Pharisees. This is not accidental. So the man's let down through the roof, and Jesus says, son, thy sins be forgiven thee. And they go, I could have figured out what they were saying. You see what I'm saying? I'm just saying I don't think you need omniscience there. And I think if we fly to omniscience, we may underappreciate some of Jesus' rather dynamic capacities as the God-man. Does that make any sense to you? All right, well, with all that background, I want to do one other thing here, and we're going to, I want to take you to, you have a set of notes in front of you, and there are two episodes that I want to think about. But I just thought, I think we got the time, and I think it would be helpful. Did I lose it again? Every time I mess with it. I think I'm going to quit doing that and just use the scriptures, see if it won't do that. All right, well, listen, I would like to think, first of all, about the nativity. He lived as a boy, his personality, and so on. What it would have been like to live up the street from young Jesus. But I think there may be value in starting with thinking just a bit about the nativity. And the reason I'm going to go there is this. Folks, I can't overstate how important it is to learn to read the Bible in terms of its own culture. And it is a worthy and delightful endeavor. But you got to work at it. It's going to take some effort. But our tendency is to extrapolate our culture onto the biblical stories. And it won't work. I always like to say, the Bible is not a culture-bound book. It will work in any culture. It is a culture-based book. Half of your Bible is history. Think about that. That's huge. Genesis to Nehemiah, Matthew to Acts, half of it is historical narrative. That historical narrative played itself out in a culture really very, very different from our own. And it's an accessible culture. You can learn this culture. And with regard to the nativity story, there are 3 points, and I'll go through them quickly. And as a point I want to make, because I think it colors so much of Jesus' entire life, but even his life there in Nazareth before he goes off to be baptized by John and commence his ministry. But there are elements of the nativity story which are so colored by this tendency to impose our own culture. So I'm going to have it up here, I trust. I'm working at it. But I want to go to the 2 nativity narratives. And the one, of course, is in Matthew 2. And I'm thinking of the actual manger scene. So sorry about that. I should have got these up there, but I can do it quickly. Now, can you see that? I can watch what I can do here. I'll just do this quick. Make it a little bigger for us. All right, now, I'm going to say, and this is a simple lesson outline here, there are 3 points in the narrative that I would like you to kind of recalibrate your head. And the first one is with regard to Mary and Joseph and the fact that Mary and Joseph were not engaged. They were betrothed to be married. Now, we talked about this a little bit last night in a different context, but there in Matthew we read, the birth of Jesus Christ was as follows. After his mother, Mary, was betrothed to Joseph. Let me show you something. Watch, see if this works. I don't know if it will for sure. This has a capacity to give me verse 18 is what I want. All right, so here is can you see this? Here is the ESV. Oh, I've made trouble for myself. This has so many capacities and sometimes, oh, boogers. I'm sorry, you guys. All right, the ESV has betrothed. The NKJV has betrothed. The NIV, all right, look at the NIV. You see it there? If I mark it, it may bark at me. But it says that Mary was pledged to be married. What does that mean? It's not hard. They're not married yet, right? They were pledged. That's what we would think of as engaged. The NASB, the old NASB, had engaged. So I'll just leave it at that. It's now, here's the thing. This is a point at which it's very, very important. And I tell people all the time, if you're really serious about marriage and burial, study marriage and burial in this culture, because number one, they're so totally different from the way we do things. And number two, it just shows up so often, not only in the narrative, but in words, pictures, and so on. So let me talk to you about Jewish marriage. There were two. Number one, it was an arranged marriage, okay? And I know that our culture, for me, this at my stage of life, I could be for this, okay? I could argue for this, but I'm probably not going to get away with it. But I always say that we regard this as kind of inhuman and barbaric, and well, I think if all the demons in hell, frankly, took a whole weekend to come up with a courtship protocol that was most thoroughly doomed to destruction and heartache, they pretty much come up with what we got. So I don't know that we got any high ground to. But the fact is that what would happen is, and I like to, let's say this is a clan and this is a clan. Here, this is a good point at which to understand. One of the dynamics that you have to take with you every place you go in Scripture is they lived as clans. They didn't live as extended clans, and that was everything. Now, in the Old Testament, of course, they're nomadic at points and they're clan, but even after they become more urbanized into the New Testament, where you have the Roman government, if somebody broke into your house and stole your stuff, you didn't call a Roman government. You didn't dial 911. That nobody's answering that phone. You had to send the clan had to enforce. We have a friend, and I haven't seen him for a lot of years, but he used to drive bus for us when we go to Israel. And he was a Bedouin. He is a Bedouin. And he lived very much as a clan. He lived in a nice little village in northern Israel in the Jezreel Valley, but his family lived there. And I used to get him talking about what it was like to live in that clan life. And he would use the illustration. He is a bus driver. He said, if somebody broke into my bus and stole something, I'm not going to call the police. I'm going to go to the city fathers. And probably before the days are out, knees are going to be broken, and I'm going to get back what was stolen. That's how you do things. And I'm not necessarily for it. I'm just saying that's what it is to live in a clan. Now, by the way, it was only, and you know what I mean, the clan, of course, is the extended family. I have another friend, forgive me all the stories, but there's a fellow, there's a restaurant we eat at all the time when we're in Israel. We stop in Jericho, and the son of the man who owns it is a dear friend, a ministry partner, but the father is Muslim. He's not a believer, but he's a gracious guy. And I was talking to him one time, and he told me he's very old. I mean, he seems very old, probably not older than I am, but his age is showing. But he told me that he was going to go to Houston in a few months. I said, "Oh, Houston, you got people in Houston?" "Oh, yeah. We had a lot of people." He said about the 1950s, some of his family started to move to Houston, and now they've got a lot of their family is there. And I said, "Well, how big's your family there?" And he said, "I think about 12,000 now." So yeah, so that's how they live. They live that way to this day, and they live in clans. Now, when in the Bible, and the point is that your clan is the source of your dignity, of your wealth, of your protection and security. It's all a function of your clan. That's how they live. And you want your clan to grow large. But the only way for your clan to grow is to have kids. And so when young people get to the age where they're physically capable of bearing children, you marry them and they get started having kids. Now, when that happens, by the way, you're not going to go off and to another town and get a job and live on your own. You're going to be part of that clan, and you're still under the tutelage of your family and your father and the clan leadership and so on. But so the point is that here is a clan. Oh, and by the way, this is why, for instance, the bride price. Now, there are a lot of dynamics to the bride price, but basically what we think of the dowry is that the husband's clan, the man's clan, is going to pay a price to the woman's family and clan because they've invested, they've grown her up. Now she's going to go off and join somebody else's clan and enlarge their clan. Does that make sense to you? This is why, for instance, forgive me for this, it's true. In Orthodox Jewish life even today, there is unmitigated rejoicing at the birth of a son and rather muted rejoicing, slightly tinged with remorse at the birth of a daughter. And they say that even to this day, when a baby is about to be born and the mother is with the midwives and the expectant father is out in another room with some of his friends, if it's a boy, the the midwives will come out and they'll be all excited and they'll run up to all the friends and they'll whisper in their ears and then they'll all try and climb over each other to be the first one to tell the man that he's had a son and so on. If it's a daughter, they come whispering in her ear and everybody just puts their coats on and goes home and leaves the guy there all by himself. Now, it's not because they don't love their daughters. It's because that daughter is going to marry into another clan. Does that make sense to you? All right, now, here's the point. Here you have a clan with a marriageable young lady. Here you have a clan with a marriageable young man. And by whatever, whether it's a matchmaker or this young man kind of gets eyes, that was often the case, but whatever, you're going to dispatch somebody, and he's called, we talked about this last night in another context, the friend of the bride, of the bridegroom, I'm sorry. He's somebody who knows the bridegroom well, and he can petition on the bridegroom's behalf. So the young man, he's not a bridegroom yet, but he comes and he petitions. And if they agree to the wedding, then there is a formal legal ceremony before a judge. And the two families come and they stand before a judge and they sign a contract. And that contract has all of the particulars and so on. It's not like a prenuptial, that's not what's going on. It's just that this will be the bride price and the wedding. They establish, there's some confusion about this, but I'm convinced. They establish the date of the wedding because the wedding is not going to happen for several months. So now they are betrothed. And betrothal means they are legally man and wife. That's what I'm after here. Disabuse your mind of the idea that they were just engaged, looking forward to being married. They were man and wife. And it takes, I always say, what does it take to break an engagement? One bad date, right? You're out of here, bud. But what does it take to break a betrothal? It takes a divorce. It takes a legal divorce. They are, but here's the thing, and this is what colors this story so. The bride and groom were expected to remain physically pure throughout the period of the betrothal. And they prized happily, appropriately, biblically, that culture prized physical purity, virginity. And it was important that they keep themselves until the actual wedding night. Now, what's going to happen? And by the way, during the betrothal period, the young man has a very deliberate, well-defined responsibility, and that is to build a home to which he will bring his bride. Now, in many cases, as a matter of fact, one of the kind of expressions for getting married was adding a room to your daddy's tent. You know, you're getting a little long in the tooth. Hey, it's about time you added a room to your daddy's tent. You know, that was. So now, again, long after they were living in tents, you still have the same thing. They would just add a room, and you would move in. You would be under the tutelage of that family and so on. But on the other hand, the bride also had a very well-defined responsibility, and that was to make herself beautiful for her wedding day. And so she would prepare herself. And the wedding was simple but elaborate, you might say. All that happened, if there was any ceremony, if there was any pledge, if there was any token, it happened at the betrothal. That was taken care of. They're married. On the other hand, on the appointed day of the wedding, the groom, with his fellows and so on, his company, would go to the home of the bride and fetch her to the home that he had built. But again, you didn't do it simply. The bride is adorned in all of her finery and her beauty and so on, and there are, depending on the wealth, there are musicians, there are poets, there are children to throw flower petals, who knows what, and you wind all through the streets of the village. And I said last night that it was absolutely obligatory that, you know, if you're just coming home from the grocery store and you come to a wedding march, you put down the groceries and you get it on for a few minutes. You know, it would be a horrible insult just to stand there and watch. So you dance and you sing and so on. I said last night, it's a favorite, but I'll just say it again, forgive me. But remember the story of Jezebel. I like to say that. Remember how Jezebel died? I like to say this is an Old Testament story you might not be able to find a flannel graph for, if you know what I'm saying, because you remember she was thrown down and eaten of the dogs. Remember that? But the Bible says that the dogs ate everything but the palms of her hand and the soles of her feet. And the Jewish, there's a midrash, a teaching on that says that the reason God thus spared those parts of her anatomy were because when she encountered a wedding march, she would dance and clap her hands. Now, again, I don't know how much better off she was for all of that, but the fact is that to the Jewish mind, that's how important that is. And I'm telling you, there's nothing in Jewish life as exciting and as joyous as a wedding. And if there is a wedding, you get there. I'll tell you something, time out. I believe with 2 or 3 fibers of my being. I mean, you could talk me out of this, but I really think that wedding feast, well, I know that the wedding feast that Jesus went to in John 2 was a family wedding. There's no doubt about it. And his mother was there, and John is careful to tell us that it was appropriate for Jesus to bring friends, and so he does, and so on. But that was the first time Mary had seen Jesus since he had gone off to be baptized. And he'd been gone for the better part of 3 or 4 months. And this is the first time she sees him. And because he had endured a 40-day fast and then had been ministered to by angels for several weeks just to get him back to health. And this is a little silly, but I often wonder if maybe Jesus didn't say to those attending angels, okay, I'm better, I'm ready, I'm going to, and the angels maybe said, I think you need a little more time, you're still looking a little weak. And Jesus said, well, you know, my mom is really going to be upset if I don't show up at that wedding. I think he may have been working hard to get to that wedding because Mary would have been pretty upset. But anyway, the point is, so now to come back to it, there is this wedding march, and then they come to the home, and the groom stays behind but then joins and so on. And then at the appropriate time, the bride and the groom go in to the wedding chamber, and they make love for the first time, and you know that in that culture, because, and they were so much brighter than we are today, quite frankly, and they could take exceptions into account, but basically they were looking for physical evidence of her virginity, and when that was discovered, it would be passed around the room. You're familiar with all that and so on. And all that to say that that's how important it was in that culture for a young man and a young woman who were betrothed. As a matter of fact, by the way, to remain pure. That's why in many cases, just as today, it was no different. If you had that situation, the temptation to physical carelessness would be the greater because we are, after all, man and wife. And so in many cases, in most cases actually, as best we can tell, the woman, the bride would often absent herself for a time, and that's what Mary does. Mary goes off to be with Elizabeth. Remember that? Now get this, and this is so real and practical. What happens is she's gone for about 3 months. She comes back to Nazareth. Nazareth is a tiny village, all right? Estimates run from 400 to 600. I think that may be a little modest because of the way it's calculated, but it was clear. It was one of dozens and scores of villages that were really the function of a cluster around a synagogue. You see, Jews want to be able to go to synagogue on Shabbat. And the fact is that the Pharisees had developed these laws and so on, and some of them were pretty crazy. But one of them was what's called a Sabbath day's journey, and they had declared that it was inappropriate to travel more than, it's about, I've seen various, about 9/10 of a mile to a mile and 2/5. I've seen various estimates. It was evidently calculated, I don't know, this is kind of interesting to me, I don't know for sure, but they say that it's calculated on the basis of how much an ox could plow in one day. That is, you know, the furrow, if you straighten it out, back and forth, back and forth. I don't know, but at any rate, it was inappropriate. You couldn't walk more than a mile, than a Sabbath day's journey. So wherever the synagogue, and by the way, the idea was not linear. Like you got to count your steps, and then you got to, after you use them all up, you got to sit down and wait for the sun to go down. It's a zone. And once you are in the zone, you can move freely about. So wherever you are on Friday evening when the sun goes down, draw a line about, you know, a mile and 2/5, and you can move around inside there. And then you come and you build your home close to the synagogue, and you have little villages clustered around the synagogue. And over here, you're going to have another synagogue and cluster and so on. That's what Jesus had to reach when he set out to saturate the land. But my point is that all right, so Joseph and Mary are betrothed. They're man and wife, and now why did I get off on the Sabbath day's journey? I can't remember what I was saying. But anyway, I don't do that very often. But all right, let's just go back to the story. I know what I was saying. Nazareth is a teeny village, all right? And everybody knows everybody. And it really can't get too much bigger because you got the dynamic of the synagogue. That's what's at stake. You know, in a lot of cities, I know it was true in LA, people who have homes within that distance of a synagogue will have a room that they will let to a Jewish family year-round. It'll only be used on Friday and Saturday. And in a lot of cities, even in Jerusalem, as the sun goes down on Friday, you'll see very Orthodox Jews in their Sabbath best and so on with a little suitcase, and they're walking because they don't live within walking distance of their synagogue, so they'll go move into that room that they rent, and that way they can keep the Sabbath at the synagogue. So at any rate, I go way back to it. My point is, Nazareth is a little teeny village. Everybody knows everybody. And now Mary, and everybody's delighted. And let me tell you something. When Mary and Joseph were betrothed, it would have been a time of rejoicing, and messages would have gone out, and there would have been a great deal of excitement. Now Mary goes away, and she comes back, and we're not told how long after she came back, but you have this verse right here that I have on the screen. After his mother Mary was betrothed to Joseph. Now, folks, that is huge. So what it's saying is but then it says, before they came together, here it is, she was found with child. Now we know, Matthew knows that it was of the Holy Spirit. They didn't know that. She was showing. And it's interesting, the next passage says this, then Joseph, being a just man. Now, quite frankly, you can read that little participial phrase in one of two ways. It's just a present participle. But you can read it, then Joseph, because he was a just man, decided, not wanting to make her a public example, was minded to put away her. I don't think that's what it's saying. I think it would be better read, then Joseph, in spite of the fact that he was a just man. In other words, Matthew doesn't want you to get the idea that Joseph was careless about the standards of purity that were appropriate in that culture. So he's saying Joseph, even though he was a just man, being a just man, but he was minded to put her away secretly. But while he thought about these things, an angel of the Lord appeared to him in a dream. Let me just stop on that and say this. Folks, you know, and you have to be careful about this, more so today than you did 20 years ago. And I'll tell you why in a minute. But there is a community of so-called, I guess you could call them legitimate scholars. They got the bona fides, of Bible scholars who disbelieve the Bible and who give their lives to discrediting the Bible. And we call this the critical community. I know that word is so rubber and used in so many different ways. But in this context, when you hear the word critical, you can just insinuate the word anti-supernatural. They don't believe in the supernatural. And they love to find purported errors in the Bible and discrepancies. And guess what? The Gospels are their happy hunting grounds because you got four guys telling the same story. So they're constantly coming and telling us that they're all, now they aren't. There are not. Not a one of them can hold water, and it's amazing. But one of the reason I mentioned a minute ago that you have to be more careful today is because of cable television, honest to goodness. In the late 70s, there was an outfit called the Jesus Seminar. You remember these guys with their little bowls and their different beads, and they were going to read the Gospels, and they were going to tell us what was really there, and when they got done, it was less than 17% of the Gospels were legitimate and so on. But they hired a publicist, and it was a well-financed critical unbelieving effort. But they acknowledged that they were tired of, here we are, the pointy heads and the academic, and we know everything. We have such insights, and you poor schlubs, you sit and listen to some pastor. And they said, we want to penetrate popular culture. We want to be heard. And that's when you started remember all these? All of that was so many, I won't go any further, but just be sensitive to this. Now, here's the point. They will argue, supplement the other. Because in point of fact, Luke tells us that an angel came to Mary and told her she was going to bear the Christ child. And you have that nobles passage where she sings her song and so on. But now think, Mary has been visited by an angel. Joseph has not. Joseph is going about his business and living out his life and preparing carefully a home for Mary. When she comes back from Nazareth, from Judea, it says she went to stay with Elizabeth in a town in the hill country of Judea. She comes back to Nazareth, and some whispers begin. And I think she's carrying a child. What is going on? Now, folks, don't spend any time at this, okay? But if we worked at it at all, we could all remember this or that incident where some young lady whom we knew did wickedly, got herself, as we used to say, in the family way, and would come up with some wild-eyed story. Remember, I mean, honest to goodness, some wild-eyed story about how she was really innocent. You see what I'm saying? Try this one on for size. You know what I'm saying? How is Mary going to explain to Joseph that in point of it can't be done? There's no way. And so, of course, an angel comes to Joseph. And he says, now I want you to eyeball this. As a matter of fact, it'd be interesting. Let me do something. This is verse 20. Let me just go back to this text comparison, and let me show you something. I can get inordinately exercised about this. But many times in the translation can fall prey to this tendency to think in terms of our culture, and it gets entirely in the way. So, for instance, in the ESV, watch this. I'm going to start right here. Joseph, do not be afraid to take Mary as your wife. Let me drop down. The NIV, take home Mary as your wife. The NASB, as your wife. The KJV gets it right. Now, let me say, that word as is not in the Greek. It's absolutely wrong. And the point is, if the angel says to Joseph, don't be afraid to take Mary as your wife, what does that mean? They're not married yet. They are married. And the thing is, what is it that constitutes the actual wedding? Is you go get your wife and bring her home. So what the angel is saying, and what we miss, one of the most poignant scenes, I think, in all of the, certainly in the nativity narrative, is the angel is saying, Joseph, don't be afraid. And he might have been. Don't be afraid to go fetch your wife. Get her, bring her home. It's not going to be any dancing. It's not going to be any rejoicing. You might be wise to do it under the cover of night. People may spit and throw stones. But go get her, bring her home. And in a stunningly winsome scene, it seems to me, Joseph does just that. So Joseph brings his wife home, and don't you suppose, and we know this is the case, that Joseph's family would have been scandalized. Here they had betrothed their son to this young man, and to this young woman, and she has evidently done wickedly. They would have been scandalized. Mary's family would have been so, just the ignominy, the embarrassment is so much more than it's easy for us to appreciate because we just don't hold to these standards. But that's what's going on. Don't be afraid to go fetch Mary, your wife. And so he brings her home. So, that's only one. But my first point is that Mary and Joseph were not engaged. They were married. And as soon as you read this phrase right here, his mother was betrothed before they came together. There is such drama in that straight. Before they came together, she was found with child. And where I'm taking you is this, that we tend to think of the nativity narrative, as much as we love it and rehearse it year by year, as just a beautiful, winsome story of a young couple who have a baby, laced with all sorts of theological overtones. But listen, there is a measure of shame and anger and ignominy in this story that now, to that end, let me take you to the second of my 3 points. My first point is that Mary and Joseph were married. They weren't betrothed, and you've got to think of it in terms of that culture. The second point, and this is, there really is no doubt about this, but the fact is, I got to go to Luke here. Mary and Joseph were not in Bethlehem because they had come to register and they were going to go back to Nazareth. They were not making a quick, let me say it positively. Mary and Joseph were moving to Bethlehem. They were relocating to Bethlehem. And I think the Bible is quite clear, although it's sort of hints. But Luke says this. Luke says that he bases this on a census. Now, there are a lot of questions about this, and I could get lost in this. I won't do it. But it simply says, Luke says that there was a census, that Caesar Augustus had given a command that all the world should be registered. Now, let me just stop on this long. Can you handle this? That is one of the places where the critics go, oh, they have a field day. They say that you can't find that in history. And it's true. It's very, very hard to find that census. The Roman government did, in fact, take regular censi. And they were tax registrations. That's all they were. They wanted to make sure they were milking every province for everything to get out of it. And they took, and we can recover something of a cycle. And none of them fits here. This is totally out of whack. And the whole reference to Quirinius. Now, let me tell you what I think is at stake, and it makes all the sense in the world, and it relieves of all the problem. Herod the Great was about to die. Herod the Great had reigned since 37 BC. It's now 1 BC. Herod is about to die, and you got to understand that Herod the Great, now you know, the only time Herod the Great even enters the New Testament narrative is when he tries to kill the baby Jesus. And then he's dead. He's a dead guy. We encounter various Herods in the life of Jesus in the book of Acts. Those are his sons and grandsons and so on. But Herod the Great, one of the most amazing men who ever lived, spend some time with him. He's one of the greatest butchers who ever lived, but he was certainly one of the greatest geniuses who ever lived, and one of the greatest political masterminds who ever lived. But at any rate, Herod had turned the little tiny kind of third world insular province, which was Judea at the end of the Mediterranean Sea, into the biggest cash cow in Rome. They got more money out of Herod. For one thing, Herod, I shouldn't get started, but there are trade routes that go through Israel. And those trade routes, the one spot where you can monitor the trade almost entirely is in Israel. And so if you control that little valley, it's called the Valley of Jezreel, and 3 passes on the southern end. If you can control those 3 passes, you can control and tax probably 60, 70% of the commercial traffic in the ancient world. So he made himself hugely wealthy because Rome couldn't control the area. They said, you figure it out. So he was able to bring that entire area into subjugation. Then he built himself a harbor. And that harbor was able to capture he made it as a first man-made harbor. It's called Caesarea Maritima. But producing part of the world, and all the oil that came out of Saudi Arabia and so on, that part of the world used to be spices. Spices were huge. I like to tell people, when you're thinking about the Bible, there are, Old and New Testament, there are 2 areas of life that we take very much for granted, that were very rare, very expensive, and they are color and scent. And both of those, to have really bright colors, to have deep, rich aromas and so on, you had a lot of manufacturing bring stuff all the way up. So that spice trade route came right through Israel, and Herod, because he built that harbor, was able to capture so much of it, and then he built huge warehouses, and they would warehouse it there. But his big cash cow, where he really made the money for Rome, was the temple, because he rebuilt that temple. And in order to build it, Rome allowed him to impose a 2-day temple tax on every Jew in the world. So if you lived anywhere in the world, you were required to send a 2 days' wage to Jerusalem for tax. And you say, well, how's he going to collect? He didn't have to collect it. Every Jewish community in the world would every year get their taxes together and put together a little army with several other villages, and they would, with great pomp, send it off, and they would make their all the way there, and they would, great pomp, come into Jerusalem and pour those alms in and so on. That was money. So the point is, Herod was Rome's biggest cash cow. And I think what's the point? But he was a madman, and he ran things according to whatever he wanted. But as long as the money kept flowing, Rome would put up with it, but Herod was about to die. And I think the point is that this is not a regular census. This is in light of the fact that Herod's soon to die. And the point is, Augustus had made the point, we can't be letting any province slip through the cracks. So when Herod dies, there's going to be all kinds of upheaval and so on, but we are going to make sure. So he kind of takes over, Augustus, the emperor, takes over the tax collecting business from Herod, and he has a census. So I think that's what's going on here. And so the point is, Joseph knows, he lives up here in Nazareth, he knows he's got to go down to Jerusalem. And I would argue that what's at stake is this, that, well, number one, I'm saying, because you always have this idea that Joseph and Mary come screeching into town just in time for the baby to be born, because they've come down to pay the temple tax, or not the temple tax, to register for the Roman census. Well, a couple of points. Number one, and this is what everybody stumbles over, but you shouldn't. Why did he take Mary? Everybody you read says, why? If he's going to go down there and just register, there is no reason in the world to take Mary. And they'll say, well, they took Mary because it was dangerous up there. And that wasn't dangerous. That was her home, for heaven's sakes. And so and she's somewhat pregnant. She's not quite as pregnant as people think. She's not about to have the baby, but she is clearly pregnant. Why would he take Mary? And I think it argues for the fact that they were moving to Bethlehem. But the big thing is this, that when, all right, think about what happens. I don't want to go all the way here, but the baby is born. The wise men come. Mary and Joseph, with angelic direction, flee to Egypt, right? What happens then? Herod dies, and the angel tells him, you can go back. And the Bible is explicit that Mary and Joseph moved back to Judea. And they settled in Judea until they heard that the Romans were going to honor the will of Herod the Great and allow Archelaus to rule in Judea, and that's when they moved to Nazareth. That's Matthew 2. So it's clear that they were not intending to go to Nazareth. They intended to go back to Judea, which is Bethlehem, I would say. So I'm just going to say, this seems really heavy, and who in the world cares, but I have a point to make. I would argue in the second place that we need to recalibrate our head. Don't think of Joseph as making a quick trip, Joseph and Mary in this case, down to Jerusalem to register for this, intending to return. They were quitting Nazareth. They were moving, I think, undoubtedly to Bethlehem. But now is the conjecture. Why? I think probably because life had become virtually unlivable there in Nazareth. That little tiny village, and Mary, now not only pregnant before the wedding night, but beyond that, has now borne the child, and Joseph has brought her home. And I think life probably, Joseph, I think, was probably, am I rattling your chain or, rocking your world here? I think he was probably a stonemason. Now, I say that because I know that the word is translated carpenter, but it means builder. It's tecton, and it means builder. That's exactly what it means. And it can be walls or homes or whatever. But the point is, you don't build with wood in Israel. There's no wood to build with in Israel. Never has been. You build with stone. So I think Jesus would. But there was a little town, and this is some conjecture, but just to put some meat on it, there is a little town just north of Nazareth where Jesus lived those 30 years called Sepphoris. And Sepphoris was a very, very important Roman town, and both Herod the Great and then later on his son Herod Antipas had poured a lot of money into Sepphoris to make it the flower of the Galilee, as Herod called it. There was work to be had. So I think one of the reasons, you got to ask yourself, well, maybe you don't, but I'm going to anyway. Why are these two families, one with a boy named Joseph and the other with a girl named Mary, they're both Judahites, they're Bethlehemites, that's their home. What are they doing up there in Galilee and Nazareth? Well, I can get into this heavy duty, but the fact is, about 100 years before Christ, a family of priest kings called the Hasmoneans or the Maccabees, remember these guys? They had Judea, Bethlehem is tough living. Hard travel, hard water storage, very little soil. Galilee is Josephus calls it at one point the ambition of nature. This is what nature would be if it could grow up and be what it wanted to be. And hundreds of thousands of Jews from the south moved up. This is about 100 years before Christ. And among them were evidently these families. And I wonder if they didn't move maybe to Nazareth because there was a village, not a village at all, very much a Roman walled town, but they were pouring all this money. There was work to be had. Now, Joseph would not have worked alone. All work in that day was day work. All right, you always went out and plied your trade. But you would do it as a work gang, a work crew. You have several guys from the neighborhood, you knew each other, you'd work together. So you get up well before the sun, pack a lunch, make the hour's trip up to Sepphoris perhaps, find one of the workmen, one of the supervisors, and sign on for the day. And then at the end of the day, you be given your pay and you come home. That's the way, and that's what Jesus did for 18 years as a mason. First of all, as apprentice to Joseph, and then I think maybe apprenticing his little brothers, but he was a stonemason. The point is, I wonder if after Joseph brought home that woman who was bearing a child that wasn't his, and nobody claimed it was his, and was conceived before I wonder if his workmates didn't say, you're not welcome to be part of our work gang anymore. We're embarrassed. And so I think for any number of reasons, I just use that by illustration. I got to give you the third one here. We're going to go eat lunch in just a couple minutes. So I'm saying, number one, honest to goodness, Mary and Joseph were betrothed, and when she was discovered to be with child, it would have been an embarrassment beyond what's easy for us to imagine. Number two, they were not just making a quick trip. They were moving to Bethlehem. Now, here's the big one, and I'll be very quick. But number one, you have this idea that, and the point is, I want to talk about where Jesus was born. And I think it's really instructive because it says that, number one, look at verse 6. So they come to Bethlehem, and then it says, so it was that while they were there, the days were completed for her to be delivered. So the Bible could not be more clear. They got to Bethlehem sometime, we don't know how many days or weeks before, but while they were there, the days were completed and she bore the child. So they don't come screeching into town, and they're not going from, Red Roof Inn to Best Western, and encountering all the no vacancy signs. That's not what's going on at all. See, here's the big problem is right here. It's this word. It says, this, he would brought forth her firstborn son, wrapped him in swaddling clothes, laid him in a manger. A manger is a feeding trough. And the only reason we know that Jesus was born where animals normally were kept is the reference to the feeding trough. And then it says, because there was no room for them in the inn. Well, that's the problematic term. The word inn in the Greek is kataluma. It is used two other times in the Gospels. In both cases, it refers to the room where Jesus took his disciples for the Passover that becomes the Last Supper. An inn is basically an upper room. That's what it means. Now, what's at stake here is this. Number one, I will argue, and I'm talking anybody into it yet, but I will argue that what you and I think of as an inn or a motel, a hostelry, a room for the night, probably didn't exist in the first century. On the other hand, there were these huge, small they were small fortifications, but they were called caravansari, and they were for a caravan to pull into in the middle at night in between two cities. So you don't have in a city a caravansari, an inn. This is what you have in halfway from Jerusalem to Jericho, where Jesus, in Jesus' parable of the Good Samaritan, remember, he took him to an inn. That would have been a caravansari. It's kind of a fortification in the sense you can bring your goods in and so on. It's because of robbers. On the other hand, in this culture, hospitality is everything. And hospitality means, this is good, but it means more than taking a couple out for pie after church. It means taking them in. And it's unthinkable in this culture that Joseph, when he got to Bethlehem, would have gone anywhere but to his family. And furthermore, and I think what's at stake is this, that the Jewish, I better not try it, but in this culture, they always built their homes so that the roof is a living space. They do a lot of things up on the roof. And one feature of the roof, and this was almost ubiquitous, it was every house had this, was a little shelter for a guest, and it was called the kataluma. So up on the roof, and it might be an elaborate thing. Remember the Shunammite woman who made a nice place for Elijah and said it had a bed and a table and a chair? Well, it would just be in many cases, I can show you pictures and so on, but anyway, it might be just like a shelter with an animal skin you could throw over the face of it and so on. It was a place you would keep the guest. And it was a place where you would honor guests. And this verse right here can be just as well read. They laid him in a manger because the kataluma, actually what it says is, there was no place for them in the kataluma. And I think you could read it this way. They laid him in a manger because the kataluma was no place for them. And I think what happened is almost certainly this, that Joseph, I'll guarantee you, he would have gone to his family, cousin, brother, who knows, a lot of his family was still there in Bethlehem. And I think when he got there, and now remember, Mary is pregnant, she's not yet ready to deliver, so they're going to have to wait for some time. And I think his family would have said to him, Joseph, we love you. And you know what? We're going to learn to love this woman whom you've taken in. But our family is so hurt, so horrified by the fact that you have, in fact, made this woman your wife. We can't give you the place of honor. Now, in almost every Jewish home, especially in a town like Bethlehem, which was again a village, there would have been an animal pen close by, and many times it would be a cave. I think there is little doubt that Jesus was born in a cave. Now that cave, again, it's not just if you're going to build a home or a wall or something, limestone is not real good to build with as fieldstone. So you want to dig out building blocks. And so you find a good strain of limestone, and you start to dig out, and you dig out the building blocks, and you leave behind a very deliberately shaped animal pen. And part of that animal pen is, as you're digging out the ashlars, you dig around a couple of just columns, but that high, and about that big, and they're just limestone, still part of the earth, and then you dig out the top of that, and that's your manger. And so I think there's little doubt that and you will often have that very close to the home. Sometimes the heat of the animals is the body heat and so on is sometimes important. So it might be adjacent to, but very close. So I think Joseph's family probably said something like this. Joseph, we love you. We can't give you the place of honor, but we want to care for you. And so we can take the animals and put them out to pasture for a little while. And you can clean that out, maybe a certain corner of it, and you can stay there. And so I think for several days or weeks, we don't know how long, but for some time, people walk by and they see Mary and Joseph living in an animal cave, and they know that it's because of the shame of that baby that she's bearing. And I wonder how many times Joseph might have gone to one of those mangers and cleaned it out and taken a brush and scrubbed as much as he could of the gnarly mud and so on out of the corners of it, and gone and got fresh grass and laid it in there in anticipation of this baby to be laid there. And it's interesting that when the angels go to the shepherds and they rejoice over the fact that the Christ child is born, and they say to the shepherds, this shall be a sign to you. Remember this. This is the only other reference to the manger. You'll find the babe wrapped in swaddling clothes. That's not the sign. Every babe was wrapped in swaddling clothes. You'll find the babe wrapped in swaddling clothes, lying in a manger. Now, why would that be a sign? You could be dead sure you got the right baby if he's laying in a manger, because you don't lay a newborn baby in a feeding trough. Nobody else would do this. But Jesus was laid in a feeding trough. Now, well into his life, actually very late in his life on earth, 6 months before he dies, in John chapter 8 of the Feast of Tabernacles, he's struggling with the Pharisees. You remember what the Pharisees say to him? We're not the ones who were born of fornication. Jesus, this lie haunted Jesus all of his life. But what I want you to see is, and I think it colors so much I think it ought to color our understanding, is that, when we read Isaiah 53 and the servant song, and Isaiah begins that by saying, who has believed our report? And what he means by that is, who can believe that after waiting for all of those thousands of years for the Messiah to come, that when he would come, there's no beauty or comeliness that we should desire him. And when we read that, we focus, I think, immediately and appropriately on the cross. I think you can take it to the manger. I think there is a level of ignominy and shame in the nativity story. It's in the story, but because we read it with Western eyes, we miss it. And I'll color what we're doing. All right, I'm a little over time here, I think. Am I keeping track? I think we're supposed to go to 4:30. Sam. Now afterwards, I'm actually going to pick up your notes and we'll go through those things.
So we're going to take a 15-minute break. So chance to go use the restroom if you need to. There's also a restroom downstairs. Very little people know about that restroom, but I'm gonna let you know. A little secret. There's one downstairs, and of course there's the ones.
welcome back. Let's sing How Firm a Foundation. Get things started off the second session. How firm a foundation, ye saints of the Lord, is laid for your faith in his excellent word. What more can he say than to you he hath said to you, who for refuge to Jesus have fled? In every condition, in sickness, in health, in poverty's fail, or abounding in wealth, at home and abroad, on the land, on the sea, as thy days may demand, shall my strength ever be. When through the deep waters I call thee to go, the rivers of sorrow shall not overflow. For I will be with thee, thy trials to bless, and sanctify to thee thy deepest distress. When through fiery trials thy pathway shall lie, my grace all sufficient shall be thy supply. The flames shall not hurt thee, I only design thy dross to consume, and thy gold to refine. The soul that on Jesus hath leaned for repose, I will not desert to his foes. That soul, though all hell should endeavor to shake, I'll never, no, never, no, never forsake. Have a seat.
We'll see. We'll see. All right, folks. There's a lot to ask of folks, so this will be profitable. I want to take you to the notes I actually gave you, and they are, again, I call it Before the Curtain Goes Up, a study in the life of Jesus before his public ministry. And again, really, we have the record in the Gospels leaps from the nativity narrative. The last thing is when Mary and Joseph do take Jesus back to Nazareth. And by the way, you have that in Matthew 2. Real quickly, let me just appeal to it. In Matthew chapter 2, after the flight to Egypt and the whole thing, it says that we made mention of this before. When Herod was dead, an angel of the Lord appeared in a dream to Joseph, saying, "Arise, take the young child and his mother, go to the land of Israel." Not very explicit. "For those who sought the young child's life are dead." And he arose, took the young child and his mother, and came to the land of Israel. But then it says, when he heard that Archelaus, now without getting into it, I'm going back to where I was, but when Herod the Great died, he had left a will. That was actually his fifth will, but he kept killing the son to whom he had bequeathed the empire, and so he had to make a new will. And so he was a total madman by the time he died. And he left his will to 3 of his sons. One was Herod Antipas, and we get to know him pretty well in the Gospels. But the other was Archelaus, and Archelaus was given the area of Judea. So clearly they had settled in Judea because they heard that Archelaus, and it's interesting that when they heard, Jesus told a parable once, I'm wandering here just quickly, but Jesus told a parable where he said, it's in Luke 19, it's on his way up to Jerusalem for the Passover, at which he will die. But he talked about a king who went away to receive his kingdom, and he left behind stewards. Remember that? And we hear that, we think, well, now what is that all about? Go away to, well, that is exactly to receive your kingdom. You see, Herod was a client king. He was a client of Rome, and he left a will, but the Roman Senate and the Roman emperor had to approve of that will. And so Archelaus and his brothers had to go back to Rome, and by the way, a number of other parties that didn't want him to rule went back to argue against him and so on. And it took several months. So meanwhile, Mary and Joseph come back to Bethlehem, I would argue, and then the word gets out that indeed Archelaus the Romans are going to honor Herod's will. And so now Archelaus is a butcher. He's going to kill 3,000 Jews at his first Passover before he even gets back from Rome, after he is given the reins. And he's going to order the slaughter of Jews. And he's only going to last about 7 years before the Romans have had enough with him. But at any rate, so Mary and Joseph moved back to Nazareth. And I've had people say, well, wait a minute, and this is total conjecture, okay? And had actually decided to relocate to Bethlehem, but now they moved back to Nazareth. Well, number one, they have no other choice. That's where they have to go. They have family in Nazareth, they have family in Bethlehem, and if Herod was a danger to the Christ child, his son Archelaus would be the more so, and angels directed him to do this. But the other thing is this, and I'll get a little bit personal here, but it's just live it out in real life. Put yourself in the moment, I like to say. It's one thing, when they're waiting for the baby, they're living there in Nazareth, everybody's upset and so on, life becomes It's another thing, once the baby has been born and so on, I always tell the story, forgive me for getting a little personal here, but our first grandchild was born to our daughter, and she got pregnant with a baby before she was married. She got pregnant by a man who was total lowlife, and which she knew it, but I won't get into it. And that daughter, I like to say that daughter is God's way to teach me the value of that verse in Joel that says the Lord knows how to buy back the years the locust ate, because my daughter today just loves the Lord and is a wonderful mother and wife, and has that baby that she bore out of wedlock, or she conceived out of wedlock, well, she bore out of wedlock, and then 3 more little girls who live 2 miles from us, and we're with them almost all the time. So she's a source of perpetual joy. But I can just remember when, and I've never been so consciously conflicted in my emotions, because we're about to have our first grandchild, and it's tremendous, and we're making ready, and they were going to move in with us, and so we're getting everything ready. But on the other hand, there is real sin involved, and you don't want to pretend that it isn't, you know what I'm saying? So exactly, you're always until the baby's born. Now it's all, you kidding me? You just embrace that baby. So I think maybe there's something of that same dynamic here, where they come back to Nazareth and they settle in with their family and so on. But nonetheless, well, let me take you to the notes, though, having said that, because, again, I want to talk about, this is what I was going to say, that the last event in the Nativity narrative is just that, when they move back to Nazareth. And the next event in Jesus' life is when he goes to be baptized by John, except Luke 2. Now, that's where we're headed. So Luke 2 is isn't your mind kind of anxious to have, we'd like to know, we'd like to trace, But all we have, and it's a marvelous, marvelous story, is Luke 2. So that's where we're headed. I want you to go to Luke 4. Because in Luke 4, there is a passage, a story, which I think is so 16. And let me say that this happens during Jesus' ministry. It's early in his Galilean ministry. Folks, No, I don't. I guess I didn't give it to you. But let me just say that Jesus begins his ministry. All right, you have it in your head that Jesus' ministry was about how long? 3.5 years. That's kind of a standard. All right, I'll tell you where you get that, though you didn't ask. It's because John gives us 4 Passovers. Now, one of them is only suggested, but there are quite clearly 4 Passovers. 3 of them are very familiar. The first Passover is when he cleanses the temple the first time. The third Passover is when he dies. Now, if you got 4 Passovers once a year, you got 3 years, right? But there were some events before the Passover where Jesus cleansed the temple in John 2. Namely, he went to be baptized, and then he was 40 days in the fasting, and then all the whatever time it took for the recuperation, and then several days before. So you've got a little time out here. Does that make sense to you? Well, then after he was crucified on the 4th Passover, he was in the tomb for 3 days, and then he resurrected and was on earth for 40 days, or about a month and a half. That's your 3.5 years, all right? Those 4 Passovers give you the 3 years, a little before, a little after. Okay, so now if you take those 3.5 years, beginning at his baptism, Jesus' Galilean ministry, which is kind of the guts of his ministry in many ways as far as his real careful presentation of himself, begins about a year in. So you're somewhere around 8 to 12 months, it's hard to be exact, into Jesus' ministry. And he begins what we remember as the Galilean ministry. For his 18 months, he's going to be up in Galilee, as I said before, saturating. Galilee was well populated, densely populated, lots of people, lots of villages. And Jesus, as I say, is very, very deliberate about saturating that land. All right, so let me just say that what we're going to look at here in Luke 4 is not during his youth, but it remembers his youth in a remarkable way. Now, before I take you there, let me take you back to the notes. Do you have these in front of you? There's I'm not going to follow the notes real carefully, but I want to see this box here. This box is I don't remember where I got it. I'm quoting somebody. But the point I want to make is this, and I'm making this point only to deny it in a few minutes. In other words, I'm going to say something to you that is absolutely fallacious as far as, that sounds awful. There are all sorts of stories about Jesus as a boy in those spurious, Gnostic, pseudo-gospels. So you got all kinds of these. There are 7 or 8 different ones, and they come from anywhere from 200 to 400 AD, long after, and they're all born out of a Gnostic mentality that is deliberately trying to make Jesus into a superboy, because they don't like the idea of Jesus' humanity. So it's wicked, and there are several stories. And I give you some of those stories, and what I'm trying to say is that these stories are all late, and they are all totally lies. But let me just read to you. The spurious infancy gospel of Thomas. I say it's 2nd century Gnostic. Has 5-year-old Jesus on a Sabbath day played by a stream, making pools and purifying the waters with a word. And Jesus takes clay and fashions little mud sparrows. And a neighbor comes and complains to Joseph that he is violating the Sabbath. And Joseph chastens his son, but Jesus claps his hands, cries out, "Begone," and the clay sparrows come to life and fly away. It's this sort of cheap little thing. Now, that story is told about 6 different ways, by the way, and it's even in the Quran, believe it or not. Another child takes a stick and destroys Jesus' pools of water, and Jesus tells the child he will wither away, and immediately it happens. Another child bumps into Jesus. Jesus tells him that he'll go no further, and immediately the child drops dead. You enjoying this? This is despicable. The neighbors are horrified. They warn Joseph that he can't live in a village unless Jesus learns to bless and not to curse. Joseph privately tells Jesus to stop, but Jesus declares that his accusers will be punished, and immediately they all go blind. He tries physical punishment, yanking Jesus' ears. As Jesus, maybe I'm overdoing it here, but here it is. His behavior changes. He is shown to heal many people and so on. He gets sweeter and so on. Now, my point is, all of these are lies. There's one story, I didn't include it there, but there's one story you hear referenced often, where Jesus was in the marketplace and a little boy bumped into him, and he chased the little boy into a goat. And when the father of the kid, if you don't mind, when he, when the kid's father remonstrated, and Joseph went to Jesus, and actually the father supposedly went to Joseph, and Joseph goes to Jesus, and Jesus says to Joseph, "Do you know who I am? I'm the Son of God. You can't, Now look, that ruined your evening. Okay, so forget it. All right, so now, no, honest to goodness, with that, what I'm after is this: that there are a lot of false stories, and they got a lot of currency, especially in Roman Catholic circles, quite honestly, that Jesus was some sort of a superboy. Secondly, and here's what I'm really after, is that I think our minds could slip into that notion kind of carelessly. We wonder, was he some, what must it have been to live up the street from Yeshua ben Yosef? And I think Luke 4 is intended by Luke to help us with that. So let me just take you to it. See what else I have here. I walk you through it, but let me take you to it. This is a fun story. Again, I'm going to say this is early in Jesus' Galilean ministry. He has just begun to aggressively confront the land of Galilee with his claims and with miracles to prove those claims. And he came to Nazareth, but notice what Luke says, and this is so instructive. Luke says he came to Nazareth where he had been brought up. So he's trying to tell us he's going back to that little village where, folks, you think of him there as a boy. He was there until he moved to Capernaum after the John 2 miracles. So he spent 30 years in Nazareth. He was born in Bethlehem, but early on as an infant, and I won't get into it, but I think he was very much an infant, maybe 6 months old, when they heard that Archelaus was going to reign, and so they brought Jesus up to Nazareth, settled in, and Jesus, he lived through all of the stages and experiences of human life. I think as a little child, he had to learn who he was. I think I say this last night or today. I think most of what he knew about himself, he learned from the scriptures. He would have to come to an awareness. There is a study, an area of study in Jesus studies or New Testament studies called the Messianic consciousness. And the question is, now that term has been hijacked and used in a heretical way, but traditionally it was just a very sincere and I think somewhat legitimate exploration of the question: when did Jesus learn who he was? How conscious was he? And when did that happen? Now I would argue, by the way, and a lot of people will put it at Luke 2. I don't think so. I think you got to understand, number one, Jesus was blindingly intelligent. His mind was not cursed by sin. And it's hard for us, and sometimes I think we think, can you really be human and not be sinful? That's so much a part about you. Oh yeah, there was a man named Adam. He was fully man, and yet he was without sin. And that's what Jesus is, the last Adam, in the sense that he is exactly what Adam was before in his humanity, before Adam fell. Now, it's interesting, we only have one kind of hint as to Adam's intelligence, and that's when in an afternoon, remember he names all the animals? And that seems like kind of a throwaway comment. It's not. The point is, and let me say, that's not naming them like Fido and Ginger, you know what I'm saying? What he's doing is taxonomy. To name in a Jewish mind is to identify, to characterize, to describe. And we struggle today with genus and species and family and all this, who goes where and so on. Adam did it in an afternoon. So, I mean, he had a mind that was totally, Jesus did, unburdened by sin. I would expect that as a very small child, his mother would sit him on her knee and tell him the accounts of his nativity and share with him all of the excitement. Mary, we know from her song, was a remarkable, and I think Joseph as well, although Mary is the one who had been primarily involved at this stage of Jesus' life, and she's the one that we get to know the better of the two. But Mary was a tremendous student of Scripture, And some of the insights she demonstrates in that song she sings in Luke are stunning, just stunning. So she knew Scripture, and she would have shared that with her son. And I think Jesus, very early on, I also wonder if Jesus as a boy did not early on recognize some sort of a really basic distinction between him and all of his fellows. In other words, maybe he was a little confused by this tendency toward naughtiness and selfishness, because he felt no bent in that way. So I think he would have been exploring who he was, and probably as a young child came to understand that, and I would argue primarily from his reading of the Scriptures. Look, you and I read the Hebrew Scriptures and we find Jesus, right? Why would Jesus, reading the Hebrew Scriptures, see what I'm saying, not find himself in those prophecies and so on? So do what you will with that, but I think, and I will absolutely affirm, that given the fact that he was in fact genuinely human, he had to grow into an understanding of himself. And but at any rate, so the point is, here's where I'm taking you. So Nazareth is a little tiny village, and he had been there for 30 years. And he had grown up. He had gone to synagogue school, every synagogue. And they've uncovered now 9 first-century synagogues. They have scores of synagogues in the Bible lands, but only 9 that are from the first century. And in each case, where they're sufficiently preserved that we can redo the floor plan and so on, there's a room called the Beit Midrash. And that was the house of learning, and it was primarily to train the young Jewish boys in that primarily to train in the synagogue. And once it was the mother's responsibility to teach the boy to read. And it's interesting, the Jewish people have always been more literate than any other people on earth. Now, that's not necessarily a knock on the other peoples. The fact is, literacy was not a big issue in antiquity because there was so little to read, because there was hardly anything in life more expensive than a book. Books were very rare. Scrolls. There were scrolls at the time. You had to kill a lot of animals. You had to clean the skins and sew them together, and then you had to have a very professionally trained scribe to write it out and so on. So they were an oral culture. They learned by listening. They were marvelous at it. They could learn. Oh, they were so much brighter than we are today. I am so weary of the hubris of modernity, that these poor primitive people. In fact, I like to say, I think you could take a dock worker off the docks of Caesarea Maritima, just some guy who worked on the docks. If you could transport him whole to this day, he would be a phenom, and he would make a lot of money working in Las Vegas, doing feats of memory that we would regard as superhuman, and he would be saying, "What are you talking about?" That's just the way they learned, and they were so. Now, on the other hand, the Jewish people were literate because Moses had told them in Deuteronomy 32, "Take heed to these books that I've written for you. They are not a vain thing for you. This is your life." Remember that? He says of the scrolls, "This is your life. Therefore, teach it to your sons and to your sons' sons and to their sons after them." So they always regarded it as an obligation to be able to interact with Moses, with the Torah. And so the mother would teach a young child to learn, to read, both women and girls and boys. And then once he knew how to read, he would be trundled off to synagogue school several days a week. And there he would just be catechized in Moses. And he would be taught Moses carefully. There's absolutely no reason to suggest that Jesus didn't do that. And so the point is that, and then after, and you would do that until you were bar mitzvahed. Now we're going to talk about that in the next session here. But once you came of age, and there was not a stated age, it couldn't be before 12, but whenever the father thought you were mature enough to be promoted to adulthood. That's what bar mitzvah was. It was the rite of passage by which the boy became a man, by which the child was introduced into the responsibilities and rights of adulthood. Once you were, I'm getting ahead of myself now, but once a boy was bar mitzvahed, he apprenticed to his father. And now he learned the trade that he was going to apply the rest of his life. And I think Jesus went through all that, and then as I said last hour, at some point Joseph dies. Jesus steps into real responsibility and leadership in that family. I think he was it's interesting that John 7, I mentioned at some point, John 7 verse 2 says his brothers did not believe on him. Now that's 6 months before he dies. After the resurrection, 1 Corinthians 15, he's going to appear to James, and James is going to believe and become a leader in the church, and the other brothers as well. But the point is that his brothers didn't believe in him. You know, I mentioned last hour that it would be difficult if you were just an onlooker, just a learner, to bow the knee to this man's claim to be a God coming to flesh. What if it was your brother? You know, this would be hard. And, you wonder, I'm being silly here, but can you imagine, maybe James and Jesus the older brother, James the next oldest, when they're out working in the shop with his dad, they're sweeping up things, and maybe Jesus has the broom and James has the dustpan, and Jesus gets a little contemplative and he says to James, I've been thinking, I think I may be some God come in the flesh. We want to go play. Will you just finish here, Jesus? But and I wonder, I'm sure Mary was a better mother than this, but there might have been times when, she took little James by the shoulder and said, why can't you be more like your big brother Jesus? So he must have been a hard act to follow as a little brother, you know what I'm saying? But however you like it, my point is simply that I think Jesus would have, it's an interesting thing. Everybody who studies the Epistle of James, and this is kind of hard to quantify, but it's almost universal. They realize that James bleeds the Sermon on the Mount. The Sermon on the Mount is the longest sermon we have recorded from Jesus. And it's not copying it, but it has the same rhythm, it has the same focus on threes, the same love of nature. In so many ways, the book of James just echoes the spirit and the ambiance almost of the Sermon on the Mount. Well, think about it. Joseph dies, Jesus becomes responsible for his siblings. How many times must he have sat them in the middle of the day when you would break, and that was the time when the evening sacrifice was offered, and so they lived by the sun. The sun was hot, so you get up before the sun. In the middle of the day, you break, you have a meal, and you have your prayers and so on. Then when the sun gets past its apex, you go back out and work till sundown. So you can imagine Jesus with his siblings, and maybe James squirming and come on, we want to go play. No, I'm not done yet. You sit right there, and then James grows up and writes a book, and it sounds like his big brother Jesus, So I think there are just, that's not probative, that's not evidence, but I think there's so many hints that Jesus was involved at that level. All right, so I lose my way. My point is, now he comes back to Nazareth, and Luke is careful to say where he had been brought up. And then he says this, and I'm going to put a reading on this that is very legitimate, but is not, people don't usually go here. It says, as his custom was, he went into the synagogue on the Sabbath day. Now, it can just as well be read this way. On the Sabbath, he went into the synagogue that it was his custom to go to. And the point is that because of the dynamic, the Sabbath day journey that I mentioned before, in a given cluster, there may have been more than one synagogue. So there was synagogues close by, but Jesus went to the synagogue that it was his family's custom to go to. Now, what's at stake, and I think the reason Luke introduces it this way, is because this is the cluster of people who know Jesus better than anybody else on earth knows him, right? These are the people. This is his synagogue. He grew up in it. There's guys in this synagogue who are still a little blistered about what Jesus did to the grading curve in synagogue school, you know what I'm saying? But they would have wrestled with him, played tag with him, whatever in the world. And so these people, and they watched as he buried his father. They watched as he apprenticed and became a master stonemason. Many of them worked with him. These people knew Jesus. Now, by this time, it's been several months, maybe actually several weeks since Jesus moved his family to Capernaum. And that would have been a big thing. So, but they know Jesus well. And now he comes back, and it says he stood up to read, and he was handed the book of the prophet Isaiah. Now, let me give you a little background here. And real quickly, everybody know what a synagogue is? Synagogue is not a church, it's not a temple, it's a gathering place. And a synagogue, it's interesting, in Galatians 4, Paul says that in the fullness of time, God sent forth his Son. And it's interesting to explore ways in which the earth was just perfectly prepared culturally. And the big one is synagogues. There were synagogues everywhere. And the Jews had begun to spread out all over the world, and everywhere they went, they'd start these synagogues. And a synagogue was just, it was where you went to get a job. It's where you went. Now, 3 times a week, Saturday, Monday, and Thursday, they would have services where they would open the ark. There was a cupboard in the back of the synagogue, and it was just a cupboard, but it was called the ark because in that, you couldn't have a synagogue without the scrolls of Moses. So in the synagogue would be the scrolls, and they were kept in there, but 3 times a week, they would open the scroll, and it seems to have been on a what's called a lectionary, where in every synagogue they would be reading the same passage. So they get the synagogue out, get the ark out. So, but my point is that the synagogue is also where you go to hear the latest gossip, to find a spouse for your child, maybe to, like I say, find work. It was just the gathering place. Remember Fiddler? Don't you love Fiddler? You got to love Fiddler. If you haven't seen Fiddler, shame on you. Go home and watch Fiddler. But you remember Tevye when he talks about if I were a rich man, all day long I'd sit around and talk about the law. That's what you do. You just go and you... So, but the point is that this is the way the prayer services, actually on Saturday, Monday, and Thursday, but this is a Sabbath service, were conducted. In every service, number one, there would be a reading of the Torah, somewhere in the book of Moses. So you get out the appropriate scroll, and you have a desk, and it's a large desk, and it's got standards or brackets, because you have this scroll which is on 2 wooden spindles, and it has big handles, and you're going to lay those handles you're going to open a scroll to the right passage and lay those handles in those brackets, because it's got to keep it off the desk. You'll have it taut enough that it doesn't touch the desk. And the reason is because if there's any sort of moisture or smear or oil on that desk and it gets on the back of that scroll, it's an animal skin, works its way through, and the next time you come to it, it'll be smudged, and you won't be able to read it. And this is the Word of God. You got to have it just the way God gave it. So it's very, very careful. So the rabbi, the synagogue scribe or rabbi, would read the Torah, and then he would always close the scroll, give it back to the keeper, put it in the ark, and then there was a seat called Moses' seat. And every synagogue evidently had a seat called Moses' seat. There's one in Chorazin that actually they found in a synagogue there, and so we always have fun with that. But it wasn't where Moses sat, it was where the rabbi sat to teach on Moses. So you always stand to read, sit to teach. So he would read the passage, then he would sit and give a short homily or whatever on it. But then there was always a second reading, and the second reading was from somewhere else in the Old Testament. It's called the prophets, but to the Jewish mind, the Old Testament is the Moses and the prophets. So it might not be one of our prophets, it might be history, might even be a writing, but it's somewhere else. And if somebody happened into the synagogue service, or somebody showed up or whatever who was known to be a teacher or who had done some nice thing, given some money, you would ask him to read the prophetic scroll. Does that make sense to you? Now, by the way, time out. I'd mentioned before, in the fullness of times, think how strategic this is to Paul. Because everywhere Paul goes, he goes first of all to the synagogue, except Philippi. That's the one exception. But otherwise, there was none there. There they had a place of prayer, so he went there. But there just weren't enough Jews in Philippi. But that's the only place he went. There wasn't a Jewish center. But anyway, the point is, Paul would go to the synagogue, and because he was a renowned rabbi, he would be invited to participate. And whatever you handed him, he could get to the gospel from there, you can bet. And so it's hugely, but I go back to it. So let's just follow the story here, and we'll. So it says, he stood up to read, and he was handed the book of the prophet Isaiah. And when he had opened the book, he found the place where it was written. Now, you can argue, and scholars do. I'm not a scholar, but I argue anyway. But whether or not this is lectionary where he was handed this, I think it was, or whether or not he actually, listen, the thing about it is, if you say, I want to read from Isaiah 61, it's liable to take 20 minutes because you got to have 4 guys twirling that, that scroll. It's a big deal to get to a passage in a scroll. That's why, by the way, the first century Christians, so at any rate, however you like it, I think he was handed the scroll. And he read Isaiah 61, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me. Now, the point to be made here is that this is one of the most thoroughly, undeniably messianic passages in the Old Testament. No Jewish person would ever suggest this was anything but a picture of Messiah. So he reads this passage, and then according to protocol, verse 20, he closed the book, he gave it back to the attendant, and he sat down, and the eyes of all who were in the synagogue were fixed on him. And then he began to say, they're fixed on him, because this is what happens next. Here's his whole sermon. They're all waiting for him. And he says, today this scripture is fulfilled in your hearing. Now, nobody in the room misunderstands him. He is real, one quick second. One of the really fascinating, Jesus told his disciples in Matthew 10, I love this passage, I mentioned it a couple of times, that they had to be, Matthew 10:16, because they were going in his name, they had to be wise as serpents and harmless as doves. And one of the ways in which, the word wise there is not the normal word for skillful living. It means clever. It means resourceful, creative, buying up every advantage and using every resource. And but by the same token, harmless as a dove. And one of the issues, and I talked about this last night, but one of the issues that you encounter in the Gospels is how in the world did Jesus get away? When Rome was so skittish about pretender kings, and how did he get away with claiming to be the Messiah King of Israel for all that time? And there are a lot of answers. The big one I said last night is John the Baptist, but there's something else. Jesus never uses the word Messiah of himself. He's very careful. And he was so careful that when the Jewish authorities were finally able to arrest him and they wanted to make the case before Pilate that Jesus claimed to be their king, remember this, when they're taking all these witnesses in the middle of the night and nobody could say, I heard him say he was Messiah King, because he wouldn't say it. But what he did, and it's amazing to watch it happen again and again in Jesus' life, is he took to himself these Old Testament passages which are so clearly messianic. What's Jesus' favorite title of himself? Son of Man, 81 times. In the 4 Gospels, he refers to himself as Son of Man 81 times. That comes right out of Daniel 7. Remember Daniel 7, the 4 beasts, and then the Ancient of Days takes his throne, and one like unto a Son of Man comes and is dispatched to establish a 5th world kingdom. So that's messianic. Nobody could mistake it for anything else. But you see what's at stake? When Jesus claims to be the Son of Man, the Jewish world is hearing him claim to be a Messiah. But if they go to, for instance, Pontius Pilate, think about it. Say, this guy's dangerous. He claims to be the Son of Man. What's Pontius Pilate going to say? Me too. What are you talking about? It sounds entirely innocuous. And that's exactly what he's doing here. He is claiming messiahship without using the word Messiah. It's very, very deliberate. He does it again and again, and he absolutely befuddles his enemies by doing it. Now, having said that, so he says, now let's pick the story up, because I lost my way. Jesus, everybody is excited. He reads this messianic passage. He sits down. They're all waiting to hear, today this scripture is fulfilled in your ears. Now, all of this was just to make one skinny little point. It's right here. So all bore witness to him, and they marveled at the gracious words which proceeded out of his mouth. And they said, now, I want you to eyeball that. So, let me read it to you again. They marveled at the gracious words which proceeded out of his mouth, and they said, we knew there was something different about this man ever since he clapped his hands and those mud sparrows flew away. Is that what it says? Honest to goodness, folks, this is really important. What they said is, what is going on here? This is Joseph's son. Now, do you see what's at stake here? The people who knew him best throughout his entire life, when they heard him claim to be Messiah, they were dumbstruck. And it's interesting that Jesus comes back to Nazareth at the end of his Galilee 18-month ministry, and it's then that he doesn't do many miracles because of their lack of faith. But you remember at the time, they say, where does this man get these words? Isn't this Joseph's sons? We have his brothers with us. We have his sisters with us. So here's my point. And I think it's an important point, though it took me a long time to get to it. But I think we can legitimately deduce, not just infer, but deduce. It's a logical conclusion that we got to come to on the basis of this passage, that if there's one word you want to write over the boyhood of Jesus, it is the word normal. That it was so normal that the people who lived out every day of it at every stage were absolutely staggered, and they couldn't get over it. So I go back to it. Whatever it is, whatever stage of life. Matter of fact, let me take you quickly then to the second study, because I can just walk into it. I give you some questions and so on, and that is Jesus at the temple at the age of 12, because the one incident that we do have is Jesus in the temple at the age of 12. But as we talk about it, and I'll be quick here, we'll be done a little early. But as we talk about it, I want you to calibrate your head in this regard, that Jesus is living out a real boyhood. And he's learning and growing, and as a matter of fact, I love the way that Luke introduces this passage in Luke chapter 2, because he says, he gives us the nativity narrative, and then he gives us one of his very typical transition statements, where it says right here in verse 40, after this is the nativity narrative through verse 39, they returned to their own city, Nazareth. And then it says in the next verse, and the child grew and became strong in spirit, filled with wisdom, and the grace of God was upon him. Now, let me do a little background here. How much do you know about the book of Luke? Luke was not an eyewitness. He probably got saved under Paul's ministry when Paul spent that whole year with Barnabas at Antioch. So Luke was not an eyewitness. But he's a Gentile who becomes a believer, and ultimately he winds up traveling with Paul. He becomes Paul's very close traveling companion and personal physician probably. And along the way, after the third missionary journey, Paul is, he's arrested, as it were, in Jerusalem. Goes into the temple, and there's a rumor, and the people riot, and the Roman soldiers, because Paul's a Roman citizen. So Paul he's really rescued. But because they don't know that they can keep him safe there in Jerusalem, they spirit him down to Caesarea Maritima, which is on the sea, Herod's harbor city. And there at Caesarea Maritima, Paul is held for 2 years. It's a fascinating, Acts 23, 24. So it's all fascinating, but all I want you to see is, I think almost certainly, well, what happened is, by now, Paul has been on 3 missionary journeys. He has evangelized Gentiles all across the Mediterranean world. He did so with one book tucked up under his arm. That's the book of Matthew. But clearly the Spirit of God has helped Paul see that it would be good if he had a telling of the Jesus story that was not quite so Jewish in its orientation. Not that that's wrong, but it's just foreign to a lot of people. So if they had a more Gentile telling of the story of Jesus, and he commissioned, by God's direction, Luke to do that. And so Luke had a couple of years to go up and interview people. And because he says that in the beginning of his, and I talked yesterday about how important it is to understand that your faith is grounded in history, and those history books were written by eyewitnesses. Now, Luke wasn't an eyewitness, but he tells us that he can be absolutely sure because he interviewed eyewitnesses. Well, I think probably one of those eyewitnesses was Mary. And now she's grown old, but can you imagine, older, but can you imagine Luke sitting and asking Mary about the nativity? Because we have all those things that we have the insight. She was able to share her song, that with Luke, and so we have her song there in Luke 2. But the point is, can you imagine Luke saying, "What was it like to have that boy, to be rearing that boy. And I picture Mary waxing somewhat contemplative, and get maybe a little teary-eyed and say, "Oh, Luke, what a boy. He grew. Every day he became stronger in his spirit." Everybody knew he was just filled with wisdom. And the grace of God was upon him. Luke didn't make that up. Somebody had to watch him grow up to be able to give him that description. And I think it's reasonable to think maybe it was Mary. But then Luke gives us the one story that we have from his childhood. Now, you know this story well. I'm going to go quickly through it, but Luke says that his parents went up to Jerusalem every year at the feast of the Passover. That's going to become very important in Jesus' ministry. And then it says when he was 12 years old, they went up to Jerusalem according to the custom of the feast. Now, you know this, that after the feast is kept and it's time to return to Nazareth, Jesus is going to tarry behind. And his parents are going to get a day's journey away and discover that he's not with them and go back, and it'll be the third day when they find him and so on, and Jesus is going to, we're going to have that conversation. Why did you seek me? But I want to stop, first of all, on this phrase, he was 12 years old. Folks, I can't prove it to you. It makes the whole story, it makes so much more sense. It fits so well, and there is every reason, I think, to believe it, but it's not specific. I think the point is that Jesus was newly bar mitzvahed. Now, there are only two times where you have, in both Luke, it's Luke 2 and Luke 3, where you have a chronological benchmark in Jesus' life. He was 12 when he went to the temple. He was 30, about 30. He was about to turn 30 when he was baptized, Luke 3:21. But I think there is a reason why Luke tells us this. And I think, now, I've had people say, no, the standard age for a bar mitzvah is 13. Well, that's today, and it's really very rubber anyway. It's not standard. But Paul tells us in Galatians what the criterion was, and that was at the time appointed of the Father. He's talking about bar mitzvah in the sense of law to grace, but he says at the time appointed of the Father, the one who, though he is a son, is treated like a child. Remember that? Now, the point is, Jesus was the best behaved, sharpest boy who ever lived. And so when he became eligible, I think probably they went ahead and had the bar mitzvah. Was there the same, today when we go to Jerusalem, I contrive really carefully. I really work hard at this to make sure that we're down by the temple, by the wall, by the Wailing Wall in that area, on either a Monday or a Thursday, because today that's when you do the bar mitzvahs. All bar mitzvahs have to happen on Monday or Thursday. And interestingly enough, the reason for that, I wondered about that, but the reason for that is because the final drama, the final act in the drama of the bar mitzvah is when the young boy is handed the Torah scroll. And everybody weeps and sings and he reads the Torah. Well, you see, it's only on Monday and Thursday they get the Torah out of the ark. So they do it on Monday and Thursday. We were there one time, I think it was on a Tuesday or something. There were bar mitzvahs going on. I went, what in the world's going on? And I asked, and somebody said, well, it's Hanukkah. It was during Hanukkah in December. And we read the scriptures every day in Hanukkah, so at the synagogue, so they were able to, they read the scriptures all the time, but the point is, this is when they have the services. But anyway, the point is that there, and you have the canopy, and you have I call it the kazoo band, they got these guys with it's great fun, and everybody dances, and you're supposed to stop and dance along with them, and so on. It's great fun. I don't know how much of that ceremony, how old that is, and so on. It's impossible to say. But we know that there was a deliberate rite of passage by which a boy was graduated to the role of adulthood in that culture. Paul makes reference to it. It's undeniable. And I think that's what's at stake. So I think what we can read it this way. Luke is saying that when he was 12 years old, he'd been bar mitzvah. This is the first year after his bar mitzvah. They went up to Jerusalem according to the custom of the feast. And when they had finished the days, the boy Jesus lingered behind in Jerusalem. And Joseph and Mary and his mother didn't know it. Now think about it. Number one, he says they went up every year. And it's the same ritual, the same routine every time. Number two, this is the best behaved boy there ever was. You never had to worry about him. Number three, he just got bar mitzvahed. So if there's any time where you could assume that he's going to... Now, let me say this, that you would never travel from Galilee to Jerusalem alone or in small groups. You always traveled. There were two routes by which you might go. I won't get into it, the ridge route and the rift route. Either way, it's dangerous. So you travel in large bands of Passover pilgrims. And generally the men will be on the perimeter, kind of watching out for things, and the women and the children in the interior, and you just make along and then camp and then make a little way. So the point is, it says they both thought him to have been in the company, that company. But in point of fact, at the end of the first day, and they were probably at Jericho. If they were taking the rift route, they were probably down the area of Jericho, and they would gather by nuclear families. And, they begin to look around, and they ask, and they scurry about, and my goodness, we've lost the Messiah. This is no good, I like to say. But the fact is, now, you can't travel at night, so early in the morning they would have started back, if I'm right, if they're in Jericho. From Jerusalem to Jericho is a descent of, are you ready for this? 4,000 feet. So Jerusalem, in order to get down to Jericho from Jerusalem, you have to cross the Mount of Olives. That's on the east side. That's 2,700 feet. The Dead Sea is 1,300 feet below sea level. You're going from 2,700 feet above sea level to 1,300. So getting from Jerusalem to Jericho is a day's work. Jericho to Jerusalem is 2 days. I mean, really, it's a lot of work to get from Jerusalem from Jericho to Jerusalem. And again, but the point is, when it says they went a day's journey when they returned to Jerusalem. Now, so after 3 days. Now, the point is on the third day. That's what they're saying. So they get back to Jerusalem, and notice they found him in the temple sitting in the midst of the teachers. Now, let me stop on that. I mentioned to you before that rabbis, there was nobody in that culture more respected than a rabbi, but as a teacher. Now, I'm a teacher. And what do I have? In order to claim I'm a teacher, what do I have? Well, I got to have a degree. Usually, I got to have maybe a job. That's good. I got to have maybe a little office. That's nice. What do you have to be a teacher in that culture? One thing, students. That's all. Because the way it worked was that if a man was regarded as a teacher of Moses and the law and the prophets, young men would attach themselves to him, and they would be itinerant because they go off to where the crops are, and by day the disciples would work and get a day's wages, and then in the middle of the day and in the evening you'd sit in the feet and so the point, and those at Passover season, those rabbis in great number, most of them would make their way back to Jerusalem, and Herod's temple that he had built, this massive temple, 38, am I right? 36 acres, Herod's temple. And large open court. And so they would just find a corner under one of those porticos, and they would set up, and it was always the same thing. The disciples, their students would sit at their feet, at his feet, and he would sit on a bench somewhere, and that was, like I say, that was called powdering yourself from the dust of the rabbi's feet. And you would just begin, and most of the teaching by the rabbis, you see, as a boy, you were catechized in Moses. But now, very, very few. But if you wanted to just, and not necessarily because you want to be a rabbi, you just wanted to know the law better, so you would take a season of life and you would attach yourself to a rabbi. But the rabbis didn't lecture. It was very Socratic. They would just engage you in difficult questions out of the law. Listen, today, a rabbinical school is called a yeshiva. Have you heard of that? Y-E-S-H-I-V-A. And I, for years, wanted to get into a yeshiva. I just thought it would be interesting. Now, you can get into the coffee house yeshivas of the conservative Jews, but I wanted to get into a Hasidic yeshiva, which you're not allowed to do. And years ago, I had a guy on my trip. He was a guide, actually. I don't use guides anymore, but I did then. And he said, well, I told him that. And he said, I know one that's got a loft, and we could go there, and they let you go up, and you can watch what's going on because you're not in the yeshiva, you're up in the loft. So we did. It was great. So we're up in this loft, and we're looking down. There's a room about this size, and it is entirely punctuated with double-sided podia. So you've got a slanted desk on either side. And there's a young Jewish a rabbinical student here and a yeshiva student there. And what happens, because we had this guy telling us about it, he said, we never get any real lectures. But what happens is, in the morning, the rabbi will come in and he'll divide us up 2 by 2, and he'll give us some sort of thorny question out of the Torah, out of the Old Testament. For instance, this is what he said. He said he might come and say, you know what? Moses says that if you've got an ox and it gets up and rips up your neighbor's garden, you got to pay for the garden. What about if you got an ox and you paid good money from a good stout piece of rope and you had him tethered to a tree, but that rope broke and ripped up your neighbor's garden? Who's responsible? The guy who sold you the rope or the guy who owns the ox? You take the guy who owns the ox, you take the guy who sold the rope. And they're going back and forth. They're just, and we're watching this buzz, and they're throwing their hands in the air and they're going over and getting these big art, the big Talmudic tomes and going through. And he said, the rabbi just walks around and listens. And then he said, about halfway through the day, I'll say, okay, switch places. You take that guy, you take it. Now they're going back and forth at it again. And that really is what rabbinical education looks like. This friend of mine, Bill Schlegel, knew that I kind of enjoyed this, and he said, Buckman, there's a yeshiva right in the Jewish square in Jerusalem, but we'd get shot if we went in there. But I've just watched, and a lot of times if it's warm, they'll bring their little podia out and they'll do it in the plant out in the Jewish square there. It's kind of public area, and we could probably sit and listen. And so sure enough, we went over. That's exactly what happened. They were doing it in Hebrew. I can't understand Hebrew. So Bill, who could recognize their accent, said, "You guys are from America, aren't you?" Yeah, we are. Well, would you do this in English for my goy friend over here? Okay, so they went back and forth, and it was really intriguing. They were just arguing about these little tiny, no, that's what he said. No, if you look here, that's not really what he said, and all this sort of stuff. And so we had to go, and I said, I asked the guys, I said, well, could you tell me, because I can't make it out, what is the question that was posed to you? What is your, what is the rabbinical question? So yeah, he said, this is the question. If a man steals a loaf of bread, takes a little piece off, puts it in his mouth, thinks better of it, puts it back, gives him the bread back, has he stolen a loaf of bread? And that's what they were going back and forth on all day long. Now, again, this is modern, but this is really what rabbinical training, and you can imagine. Now, the point is that they would bring, in Jesus' day, at Passover, they would bring, and so young Jesus, well, he's now you have to understand, he has been newly promoted to the status of manhood. And this is where I'm going to take you, and real quickly. So Jesus, I think, was intrigued by it. He was, I'm sure he was familiar with it before. And this is perfectly legitimate. They want people to enter in and so on. And notice what it says, by the way. I hear people say sometimes that Jesus was being uppity or snotty or showing people up or embarrassed. No, Jesus would not do that, number one. It was just I think he reflected the spirit of the law as well as a knowledge of the law. But it says, they found him in the temple, sitting in the midst of the teachers, listening to them and asking them questions. And all who heard him were astonished at his understanding and answers. Now, listening to them and answering questions, the idea is he was playing by their rules. He was engaging them in the kind of interchange that was very familiar to him. And they were astonished at his understanding and answers. Now, let me tell you something. Why was it that Jesus could amaze people with his understanding of his Father's scriptures? It was because he had studied those scriptures. That's so important. We tend to think, let me just tell you something, and take this under advisement, but I think it's legitimate. One of my heroes in life is a man named Bruce Ware. W-A-R-E, and he's a theologian, teaches at Southern Seminary in Louisville, but he has made it his passion in life to bring people face to face with the real humanity of Jesus. And he does it magisterially, exegetically, passionately. I love him. I can't get enough of him. And I count him a dear friend. But he says, all right, hold on to your hat here. He says, if the question before you want to ask the question, what role did Jesus' deity play in his life? If you're going to ask about ontology, do you know that word ontology? Ontos is the Greek word for being. So his beingness, his essence. Ontology is the quintessence, what he is, if you could actually get down to the parts. If you want to talk about his ontology, it was all important. His deity was every bit as important as his humanity. But here, hold on to your hats. I think this is true. If you want to ask the question as to what Jesus' deity meant to the way he lived his life, it was irrelevant. Chew on that. I think it's true. I think he lived his life as a human being. Now, he was aware of it, but as far as, and I go to it here because people have the idea, well, he was God come in the flesh. He knew this. No. He was able to demonstrate, and Ware makes a big deal of this right here, that the reason Jesus was able to amaze people with his proficiency in the Scriptures because he loved the Scriptures, and he studied the Scriptures, and he memorized the Scriptures, and he lived the Scriptures. You know, I like to say when he was a child, he tasted it and found it sweet, and therefore you have this capacity. And then as an adult, you remember he tested it, found it strong there at the temptation. And Jesus is not using the Scriptures like some sort of, like I say, like some sort of cross before a vampire or something. You know what I'm saying? When Jesus appealed to the Scriptures, the point is that he obeyed the Scriptures. He knew what the Scriptures taught. No matter how hungry he wasn't going to answer the temptation of the devil to change those stones to bread. So the point is that Jesus here now let me finish the story here, because his parents come, and this is such a winsome scene. It says, so when they saw him, they were amazed. And that's exactly what the word means. They must have thought, has he been kidnapped? Has he fallen into a well? Is he sick? Where could he be? So certainly they've gone wherever they know that he might be, and then they come to the temple, and Jesus says, why did you seek me? He doesn't mean, why'd you come looking for me? Leave me alone. He means, why would you look anywhere else besides my Father's house? And so they're amazed that he's there, full health and so on. And so Mary comes, and again, Mary, oh, such a woman. But she comes, and I picture her. I mean, I'm adding to it here, but maybe Jesus is sitting there with all these others around, and it's quite a bit of excitement, and a crowd would come. Listen, I always say, in our culture, you want to demonstrate that you're a man among men. What do you got to do? You got to, I don't know, beat everybody in arm wrestling or something like that. This culture, you want to prove yourself a man among men, you're able to silence your enemy in open debate. You're able to answer questions. This would have been a huge crowd. And so I picture Mary maybe making her way through the crowd. What is going on? Maybe coming up behind her young son, who is now a man, Jesus, and leaning over and saying, Son, why have you done this to us? Your father and I have sought you anxiously. That's a mother's plea. And he says, well, why did you look anywhere else? Why did you seek me? Did you not know that I must be about my Father's business? Now let me show you something here. I can do this quickly. What do we got here? Luke 2:50. Just compare this in various translations. So, you can't see it anyway, huh? I'm going to try it real quick because it might come back. But I'll just tell you in the meanwhile, because there's something else I'd like to look at. We'll see. In most translations, this is translated, didn't you know I must be at my Father's house? That's how it's usually translated. The King James and the New King James have about my Father's business. Both of those are a bit expansive. What it actually says in the Greek very explicitly is, I must be about that which is my Father's. Now, here is where I think it's helpful to understand that very possibly this was immediately, there are the translations, but I'm up one verse here. So again, ESV has house. NIV, I'm pretty sure, has house. So, and again, I'm going to say, it doesn't say either one of those. What it says, this is where, folks, I think it's important. I think it's helpful to see that Jesus is newly bar mitzvahed. Because what's at stake is this, that when you are bar mitzvahed, you get busy apprenticing. You know, in our culture, kids have legitimately enough spend a lot of time thinking, what am I going to do when I grow up? Not in that culture. You're going to do what your father does. And when you are bar mitzvahed, you, as a boy, you are busy, you apprentice to your father. Now, here's where I'm going to ask for a little patience. We're done in just a minute. Think with me. See if you can handle this. I asked this question last night, and it seems like a strange question. Well, let me ask it of you. If there were two-wheelers, this is going to seem like a total bizarre thing, but I'm headed somewhere. If there were two-wheelers in Jesus' day, could Jesus have ridden a two-wheeler the first time he tried? Yeah, well, I argue no. It's a learned thing, just like anybody else. You got to learn to do this. Being the God-man doesn't advantage you in riding a bicycle, so you'd have to learn. All right. As he learned to ride a bicycle, if he fell and skinned his knee, should his parents punish him for it? Well, of course not. That's what it is to learn. Folks, Jesus is trying on humanity for the first time. And I think that what's at stake here is that Jesus, his thought was this. He had learned from the scriptures that he was uniquely the son of his Father in heaven. He knew that his Father intended for him to be the Messiah. And in this culture, when you bar mitzvah, you get busy about whatever your Father has for you. And so I think Jesus very possibly, as a young man, thought, I've been bar mitzvahed. It's time to be about my Father's business. That is the messianic work. But Jesus had two fathers. And in point of fact, it was. And in the next verse is so instructive to me because the next verse says, therefore, that's not the right passage. Verse 51, then he went down with them and came to Nazareth and was subject to them. And I think the point is he went somehow, and I don't know how, but it's not too hard to imagine, Mary's motherly, loving hurt. Why have you done this to us? The Spirit of God used that in young Jesus' mind and heart to help him understand the day comes when, as an adult, he hears that John the Baptist is baptizing, and he goes in all obedience, that he had been hungry for 18 years. That makes sense to you? So I think what you have here is young Jesus learning what the Father's will is, and then waiting patiently. There's one other thing, just let me mention, and then we're done. One of the privileges of adulthood, you see, the temple, which had been remodeled by Herod there in Jerusalem, had this outer court. That was for anybody, court of the Gentiles. And then you go through a gate, and you'd come in to past a little balustrade that warned you not to come any further if you're a Gentile. And you go into what's called the court of the women. That's as far as women and underage boys could go. And then beyond that, there were 15 steps, and that probably reflects the Psalms of Ascent in Psalm 120 to 135. You would cite those Psalms as you made your way up. And then you would go through a huge gate called Nicanor, and you would go into the gate of the court of Israel. Now that is where the altar and the laver were. That's where the sacrifices were actually done. And up until a boy was bar mitzvahed, he could go no further than the court of women. So I think very possibly this plays into it, that this is the first year that Jesus, every other year, Jesus, here comes Joseph, and he's got his family, and they purchase this lamb, and he's got the lamb on his neck, and they come, and the family has to stop, and maybe Joseph takes his mother Mary's arm and stands by her as Joseph goes alone into the court of Israel. A few minutes later, he comes back, he's got a basket, he's got the Passover meat, they go out, they find a place where they're going to worship, have it, and this is the first year, if you don't mind, where young Jesus, now the man Jesus, if you don't mind, in that culture, drops his mother's arm and maybe takes Joseph by the arm and goes with Joseph into the court of Israel. And he would have been singing as he did so, as every Jewish boy did as he entered those sacred precincts for the first time. He would have been singing, I was glad when they said unto me, come into the house of the Lord. So Jesus goes in, and for the first time in his mortal life, he watches as a Passover lamb is slain. We think of the temple as a pristine cathedral. It was a slaughterhouse. And it was a very deliberate slaughterhouse. That is, it was deliberately a slaughterhouse. God was teaching you something. And so Jesus, for the first time in he watches his spirit that said, I'm committed, I'm hungry to be about my Father's business, but it wasn't the Father's time. And he's going to wait for 18 years. On your notes, I gave you 3 little points of application, but I think it works. And that is that from this lesson, which is a very cusp experience in Jesus' life, you learn that he certainly had a desire for the Word of his Heavenly Father. I think he had studied it, and he loved to interact on it, and so on. But he also was gripped by dedication to the work of his Heavenly Father. His spirit was, I must be about the work of my Father's business. He was hungry, but he was also entirely submissive to the will of his Father, because it wasn't the Father's will at this time for him to commence a messianic ministry. And that's going to wait until 18 years later. So again, like I say, this is the one narrative glimpse we have. We have Luke 4 to kind of give us the very, very unmistakable impression that his life was very, very normal as a boy. But the one drama we have is right here, and it is certainly everything to be admired. All right. Any questions about all that? I've worn you out, for heaven's sakes. I tell my students all the time, I'm doing all the work up here. What are you whining about? But I know it's work to be where you're at, too. So, all right. Well, once again, let me just say thank you so much for the opportunity. And Sam, I appreciate the invite, and I really, really honor you. Not many of you were here yesterday, but it was really a bottomlessly refreshing day to be with all these pastors. Not, dozens of them, but and they all love the Lord and love one another and so on. So God bless you, and I trust it'll grow appropriately. But thank you so much for the time to be with you. Let me have a word of prayer. All right, and we'll be dismissed, I believe. You got anything else to do? All right, let's have a word of prayer. Our Father in heaven, I thank you for the delight that's been mine and my wife's to be here. We love this family, the Martins. We love this work that we've only known from afar up until this week. And just simply because we love you and we love those who love you and minister on your behalf. And we cherish the opportunity to see what you are able to do in a place as hard as it might be with people who are absolutely committed, who are anxious to see the gospel prove itself effective in the lives of people throughout this community, who are willing to give themselves to that effort. Father, thank you so much for it. I pray your richest blessing upon this work. Father, I would ask that you might minister carefully and deliberately and individually to each person involved here. There are people at all sorts of various stages of spiritual growth and sometimes even interest. Father, in each case, I'd pray that you might minister. We know that you have promised us that he who wills to know will know, and so I'd pray that you might excite in every one of us just a desire to know you better, to serve you more carefully, and to honor you more dramatically in our lives. So we give this work and the leadership of this work to you. Thank you for the time we've had. Thank you for these dear folk and their willingness to endure the hours here just working through some of these elements of the life of Christ. And Father, again, we love you. We thank you for the gift of your Son and ask that you might just minister in us and to us and through us in days to come. And we'll thank you in Christ's name. Amen. All right, take the rest of the day off, I think. Best I know.